Hi, welcome back to Storytime. Today we are going to be finishing our Oz sort of a readathon. Not really, since it's just me, but we've had the Oz series going for. This will be the end of the 6th book, so we're going to be completing it today. And as you can see, I changed the background color to a greener color instead of the really nice light blue that I had before. And I thought, this is the final one, and also we're reading about the Emerald City of Oz, so it kind of made sense to me to put a nice green tint to it. So that's why it looks a little different today. All right, and today's story time is going to be a bit longer. It could go as long as 2.5 or 3 hours, because the Emerald City of Oz so far has been the longest Oz book that I've read. Usually the other ones just take a cool 4 hours. This looks like it's going to be more 5 or 6 hours in total, which it was hard to tell because I'm reading them out of a collection. I have like 2 collections of 3 books, and I've really been wanting to dig into this one because it has a beautiful cover. I'll try to remember to post it up on the Discord. And of course, you'll see this little guy right here if you're returning. I have him up when I'm chatting before the book, after the book, and between chapters. So if you're watching on YouTube and you just want to skip all of the chat, just look for him to go away. This is Maestro, by the way. All right. So we'll go ahead and get started. Chapter 15, How Dorothy Happened to Get Lost. It was a beautiful evening, so they drew their camp chairs in a circle before one of the tents and began to tell stories to amuse themselves and pass away the time before they went to bed. Pretty soon a zebra was seen coming out of the forest, and he trotted straight up to them and said politely, "Good evening, people." The zebra was a sleek little animal and had a slender head, a stubby mane, and a paintbrush tail, very like a donkey's. His neatly shaped white body was covered with regular bars of dark brown, and his hoofs were delicate as those of a deer. "Good evening, friend zebra," said Omby Amby in reply to the creature's greeting. "Can we do anything for you?" "Yes," answered the zebra. "I should like you to settle a dispute that has long been a bother to me as to whether there is more water or land in the world." "Who are you disputing with?" asked the wizard. "With a soft-shell crab," said the zebra. "He lives in a pool where I got to go to drink every day, and he is a very impertinent crab, I assure you. I have told him many times that the land is much greater in extent than the water, but he will not be convinced. Even this very evening, when I told him he was an insignificant creature who lived in a small pool, he asserted that the water was greater and more important than the land. So, seeing your camp, I decided to ask you to settle the dispute for once and all, that I may not be further annoyed by this ignorant crab." When they had listened to this explanation, Dorothy inquired, "Where is the soft-shell crab?" "Not far away," replied the zebra. "If you will agree to judge between us, I will run and get him." "Run along, then," said the little girl. So the animal pranced into the forest and soon came trotting back to them. When he drew near, they found a soft-shelled crab clinging fast to the stiff hair of the zebra's head, where it held on by one claw. "Now then, Mr. Crab," said the zebra, "here are the people I told you about, and they know more than you do, who lives in a pool, and more than I do, who lives in a forest, for they have been travelers all over the world, and know every part of it." "There is more of the world than Oz," declared the crab in a stubborn voice. "That is true," said Dorothy, "but I used to live in Kansas in the United States, and I've been to California and to Australia, and so has Uncle Henry." "For my part," added the Shaggy Man, "I've been to Mexico and Boston and many other foreign countries." I like that Boston is a foreign country. "And I," said the wizard, "have been to Europe and Ireland." And I love how Ireland is apparently not in Europe. So you see, continued the zebra, addressing the crab, here are people of real consequence, who know what they are talking about. Then they know there's more water in the world than there is land, asserted the crab in a shrill, petulant voice. They know you are wrong to make such an absurd statement, and they will probably think you are a lobster instead of a crab, retorted the animal. At this taunt, the crab reached out its other claw and seized the zebra's ear, and the creature gave a cry of pain and began prancing up and down, trying to shake off the crab, which clung fast. "Stop pinching!" cried the zebra. "You promised not to pinch if I would carry you here." "And you promised to treat me respectably," said the crab, letting go of the ear. "Well, haven't I?" demanded the zebra. "No, you called me a lobster," said the crab. "Ladies and gentlemen," continued the zebra, "please pardon my poor friend because he is ignorant and stupid and does not understand. Also, the pinch of his claw is very annoying. So pray tell him that the world contains more land than water, and when he has heard your judgment, I will carry him back and dump him into his pool, where I hope he will be more modest in the future." "But we cannot tell him that," said Dorothy gravely, "because it would not be true." "What?" exclaimed the zebra in astonishment. "Do I hear you right?" "The soft-shell crab is correct," declared the wizard. "There is considerably more water than there is land in the world." "Impossible!" protested the zebra. "Why, I can run for days upon the land and find but little water." "Did you ever see an ocean?" asked Dorothy. "Never," admitted the zebra. "There is no such thing as an ocean in the land of Oz." "Well, there are several oceans in the world," said Dorothy, "and people sail in ships upon those oceans for weeks and weeks and never find a bit of land at all. And the geographies will tell you that all the oceans put together are bigger than all the land put together." At this, the crab began laughing in queer chuckles that reminded Dorothy of the way Billina sometimes cackled. "Now will you give up, Mr. Zebra?" it cried jeeringly. "Now will you give up?" The zebra seemed much humbled. "Of course I cannot read geographies," he said. You could take one of the wizard's school pills," suggested Billina, "and that would make you learned and wise without studying." The crab began laughing again, which so provoked the zebra that he tried to shake the little creature off. This resulted in some more ear-pinching, and finally Dorothy told them that if they could not behave, they must go back to the forest. "What, Maestro? What do you want? Are you hyper, or are you being chased by Snockings?" "Come here, sit in my lap. You are hyper." Sorry about this. I'll backtrack a little. The crab began laughing again, which so provoked the zebra that he tried to shake the little creature off. This resulted in more ear-pinching, and finally Dorothy told them that if they could not behave, they must go back to the forest. "I'm sorry I asked you to decide this question," said the zebra crossly. "So long as neither of us could prove we were right, we quite enjoyed the dispute. But now I can never drink in that pool again without the soft-shell crab laughing at me. So I must find another drinking place." Do, you ignoramus!" shouted the crab so loudly as his little voice would carry. "Rile some other pool with your clumsy hooves and let your betters alone after this." Then the zebra trotted back to the forest, bearing the crab. The yellow hen now turned one eye up toward the little girl and asked, "Have you forgotten where the camp is, Dorothy?" "Yes," she admitted. "Have you, Billina?" "I didn't try to remember," returned Billina. "I've no idea you would get lost, Dorothy." It's the thing we don't expect, Billina, that usually happens," observed the girl thoughtfully. "But it's no use standing here. Let's go in that direction," pointing a finger at random. Or maybe we'll be out of the forest over there. Oh, we'll get out of the forest. So on they went again, but this way the trees were closer together, and the vines were so tangled that often they tripped Dorothy up. Suddenly a voice cried sharply, "Halt!" At first Dorothy could see nothing, although she looked around very carefully. But Billina exclaimed, "Well, I declare!" "What is it?" asked the little girl, for Toto began barking at something, and following his gaze, she discovered what it was. A row of spoons had surrounded the three, and these spoons stood straight up on their handles and carried swords and muskets. Their faces were outlined in the polished bowls, and they looked very stern and severe. Dorothy laughed at the queer things. "Who are you?" she asked. "We are the Spoon Brigade," said one. "In the service of His Majesty King Cleaver," said another. "And you are our prisoners," said the third. Dorothy sat down on an old stump and looked at them, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "What would happen," she inquired, "if I should set my dog on your brigade?" "He would die," replied one of the spoons sharply. "One shot from our deadly muskets would kill him, big as he is." "Don't risk it, Dorothy," advised the yellow hen. "Remember, this is a fairy country, yet none of us three happens to be a fairy." Dorothy grew sober at this. "Perhaps you're right, Billina," she answered. "But how funny it is to be captured by a lot of spoons." "I do not see anything very funny about it," declared a spoon. "We are the regular military brigade of the kingdom." "What kingdom?" she asked. "Utensia," said he. "I never heard of it before," asserted Dorothy. Then she added thoughtfully, "I don't believe Ozma ever heard of Utensia either. Tell me, are you not subjects of Ozma of Oz?" "Oh, hey, Swags, good to see you." "Are you not streaming today because you have, was it pickleball later, I think?" "We have never heard of her," retorted a spoon. "We are subjects of King Cleaver, and obey only his orders, which are to bring all prisoners to him as soon as they are captured. So step lively, my girl, and march with us, or we may be tempted to cut off a few of your toes with our swords." This threat made Dorothy laugh again. She did not believe she was in any danger, but here was a new and interesting adventure, so she was willing to be taken to Utensia, that she might see what King Cleaver's kingdom was like. Oh, okay. Well, I hope you enjoy your little hang, and I'll probably be over your way after story time, but I mentioned in the beginning of the stream, this is going to be a bit longer because I didn't realize that the Emerald City of Oz is about half again as much longer as all of the other Oz books, so yeah. But, it's fun. I've actually been enjoying this a lot more than books 3 and 4. 3 and 4 just kind of seemed like, the episodes in shows when they need like a filler, and so they just show you all the best hits from the previous episodes. But yeah, I'm enjoying this one. Fresh danger and adventure. Chapter 16. How Dorothy visited Utensia. There must have been from 6 to 8 dozen spoons in the brigade, and they marched away in the shape of a hollow square, with Dorothy, Billina, and Toto in the center of the square. Before they had gone very far, Toto knocked over one of the spoons by wagging his tail, and then the captain of the spoons told the little dog to be more careful, or he would be punished. So Toto was careful, and the Spoon Brigade moved along with astonishing swiftness, while Dorothy really had to walk fast to keep up with it. By and by they left the woods and entered a big clearing in which was the kingdom of Utensia. Standing all around the clearing were a good many cook stoves, ranges, and grills of all sizes and shapes, and besides those were several kitchen cabinets and cupboards, and a few kitchen tables. These things were crowded with utensils of all sorts, frying pans, saucepans, kettles, forks, knives, basting and soup spoons, nutmeg graters, sifters, colanders, meat saws, flat irons, rolling pins, and many other things of a like nature. When the spoon brigade appeared with the prisoners, a wild shout arose, and many of the utensils hopped off of their stoves or their benches and ran crowding around Dorothy and the hen with the dog. "Stand back!" cried the captain sternly, and he led his captives through the curious throng until they came before a big range that stood in the center of the clearing. Beside this range was a butcher's block upon which lay a great cleaver with a keen edge. It rested upon the flat of its back, its legs were crossed, and it was smoking a long pipe. "Wake up, your majesty," said the captain. "Here are prisoners." Hearing this, King Cleaver sat up and looked at Dorothy sharply. "Gristle and fat," he cried. "Where did this girl come from?" "I found her in the forest and brought her here as a prisoner," replied the captain. "How did you do that?" inquired the king, puffing his pipe lazily. Why did you do that?" "To create some excitement," the captain answered. "It is so quiet here that we are all getting rusty for want of amusement. For my part, I prefer to see stirring times." A stirring because he's a spoon. "Naturally," returned the cleaver with a nod. "I have always said, Captain, without a bit of irony, that you are a sterling officer and a solid citizen, bold and polished to a degree. But what do you expect me to do with these prisoners?" "That is for you to decide," declared the captain. "You are the king." To be sure," muttered the cleaver musingly. "As you say, we have had dull times since the steel and grindstone eloped and left us. Command my counselors and the royal courtiers to attend me, as well as the high priest and the judge. We'll then decide what can be done." The captain saluted and retired, and Dorothy sat down on an overturned kettle and asked, "Have you anything to eat in your kingdom?" "Here, get up! Get off of me!" cried a faint voice, at which his majesty the cleaver said, "Excuse me, but you're sitting on my friend the 10-quart kettle." Dorothy at once arose, and the kettle turned right side up and looked at her reproachfully. "I'm a friend of the king, so no one dares sit on me," said he. "I'd prefer a chair anyway," she replied. "Sit on that hearth," commanded the king. So Dorothy sat on the hearth shelf of the big range, and the subjects of Utensia began to gather around in a large and inquisitive throng. Toto lay at Dorothy's feet, and Billina flew upon the range, which had no fire in it, and perched there as comfortably as she could. When all the counselors and courtiers had assembled, and these seemed to include most of the inhabitants of the kingdom, the king rapped on the block for order and said, "Friends and fellow utensils, our worthy commander of the Spoon Brigade, Captain Dip, has captured the 3 prisoners you see before you, brought them here I don't know what for. So, I ask your advice how to act in this matter, and what fate I should mete out to these captives. Judge Sifter, stand on my right. It is your business to sift this affair to the bottom. High Priest Colander, stand on my right and see that no one testifies falsely in this matter." As these 2 officials took their places, Dorothy asked, "Why is the Colander the high priest?" "He's the holiest thing we have in the kingdom," replied the King Cleaver. I love all these puns. "Except me," said the sieve. "I'm the whole thing when it comes to holes." "What we need," remarked the king rebukingly, "is a wireless sieve. I must speak to Marconi about it. These old-fashioned sieves talk too much. Now, it is the duty of the king's counselors to counsel the king at all times of emergency. So, I beg you to speak out and advise me what to do with these prisoners." "I demand that they be killed several times, until they are dead," shouted a pepperbock, hopping around very excitedly. Oh, I like this voice. Compose yourselves, Mr. Paprika," advised the king. "Your remarks are piquant and highly seasoned, but you need a scattering of common sense. It is only necessary to kill a person once to make him dead, but I do not see that it is necessary to kill this little girl at all." "I don't either," said Dorothy. "Pardon me, but you are not expected to advise me in this matter," replied King Cleaver. "Why not?" asked Dorothy. "You might be prejudiced in your own favor and so mislead us," he said. "Now then, good subjects, who speaks next?" "I'd like to smooth this thing over in some way," said a Flatiron earnestly. "We are supposed to be useful to mankind, you know." "But the girl isn't mankind, she's womankind," yelled a Corkscrew. "What do you know about it?" inquired the king. "I'm a lawyer," said the Corkscrew proudly. "I'm accustomed to appear at the bar." "But you're crooked," retorted the king, and that debars you. You may be a corking good lawyer, Mr. Pop, but I must ask you to withdraw your remarks." "Very well," said the Corkscrew sadly. "I see I haven't any pull at this court." "Permit me," continued the Flatiron, "to press my suit, your majesty. I do not wish to gloss over any fault the prisoner may have committed, if such a fault exist, but we owe her some consideration, and that's flat." "I'd like to hear from Prince Carver," said the king. At this, a stately carving knife stepped forward and bowed. "The captain was wrong to bring this girl here, and she was wrong to come," he said. "But now that the foolish deed is done, let us all prove our mettle and have a slashing good time." "That's it! That's it!" cried a fat chopping knife. "We'll make mincemeat of the girl, and hash of the chicken, and sausage of the dog." There was a shout of approval at this, and the king had to rap again for order. "Gentlemen, gentlemen," he said, "your remarks are somewhat cutting and rather disjointed, as might be expected from such acute intellects. But you give me no reason for your demands." "See here, Cleaver, you make me tired," said a saucepan, strutting before the king very impudently. "You're about the worst king that ever reigned in Utensia, and that's saying a good deal. Why don't you run things yourselves instead of asking somebody's advice like the big clumsy idiot you are?" The king sighed. "I wish there wasn't a saucepan in my kingdom," he said. "You fellows are always stewing over something, and every once in a while you slop over and make a mess of it. Go hang yourself, sir, by the handle, and don't let me hear from you again." Dorothy was much shocked by the dreadful language the utensils employed, and she thought that they must have had very little proper training. So she said, addressing the king, who seemed very unfit to rule his turbulent subjects, "I wish you'd decide my fate right away. I can't stay here all day, trying to find out what you're going to do with me." "This thing is becoming a regular broil, and it's time I took part in it," observed a big gridiron coming forward. "What I'd like to know," said a can-opener in a shrill voice, "is why the little girl came to our forest anyhow, and why she intruded upon Captain Dip, who ought to be called Dippy, and who she is, and where she came from, and where she is going, and why, and wherefore, and therefore, and when." "I'm sorry to say, Sir Jabber," replied the king to the can-opener, "that you have such a prying disposition. As a matter of fact, all the things you mentioned are none of our business." Having said this, the king relighted his pipe, which had gone out. "Tell me, please, what is our business?" replied the potato masher, winking at Dorothy somewhat impertinently. "I'm fond of little girls myself, and it seems to me she has as much right to wander in the forest as we have." "Who accuses the little girl, anyway?" inquired a rolling pin. "What has she done?" "I don't know. What has she done, Captain Dip?" said the king. "That's the trouble, your majesty. She hasn't done anything," replied the captain. "What do you want me to do?" asked Dorothy. This question seemed to puzzle them all. Finally, a chafing dish exclaimed irritably, "If no one can throw any light on this subject, you must excuse me if I go out." At this, a big kitchen fork pricked up its ears and said in a tiny voice, "Let's hear from Judge Sifter." "That's proper," returned the king. So Judge Sifter turned around slowly several times and then said, "We have nothing against the girl except the stove hearth upon which she sits. Therefore, I order her instantly discharged." "Discharged?" cried Dorothy. "I never was discharged in my life, and I don't intend to be. But if it's all the same to you, I'll resign." "It's all the same," declared the king. "You are free, you and your companions, and may go wherever you like." "Thank you," said the little girl. "But haven't you anything to eat in this kingdom? I'm hungry." "Go into the woods and pick blackberries," advised the king, lying down upon his back again and preparing to go to sleep. "There isn't a morsel to eat in all of Utensia that I know of." So Dorothy jumped up and said, "Come on, Toto and Billina. If we can't find the camp, we may find some blackberries." The utensils drew back and allowed them to pass without protest, although Captain Dip marched the Spoon Brigade in close order after them until they had reached the edge of the clearing. There the spoons halted, but Dorothy and her companions entered the forest again and began searching diligently for a way back to their camp, that they might rejoin their party. Chapter 17. How they came to Bunbury. Wandering through the woods without knowing where... sorry. Really quickly, this reminds me. There was a little radio serial. I don't remember how many years ago it came out, but it was called Bunbury. And it was sort of... a sarcastic look at the characters that are mentioned in stories and poems and stuff, but never actually appear. And so if you're familiar with The Importance of Being Earnest, the main character mentions that he is going bunburying, which, basically he says that he's going to go visit his friend Bunbury, and then doesn't actually. I don't remember exactly what it was. So the main character in this is Bunbury, the character who is, supposed to be the excuse. And he finds out that he's just a fictional character who doesn't even appear in the fictional work in which he is mentioned. And so he decides to find all of the other characters in fictional works that are mentioned but don't actually show up. And then they try to write literature and write R-I-G-H-T as opposed to W-R-I-T-E. It's so funny, and especially what happens after they have quote unquote corrected literature. The rendition of The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe is the most beautiful thing ever. I won't spoil it for you though. I'll see if I can find an online version, and I'll try to post it on my Discord and Twitter. But anyways, tangent aside, we will continue. Chapter 17. How they came to Bunbury. Wandering through the woods without knowing where they were going or what adventure you are about to meet next is not as pleasant as one might think. The woods are always beautiful and impressive, and if you are not worried or hungry, you might enjoy them immensely. But Dorothy was worried and hungry that morning, so she paid little attention to the beauties of the forest and hurried along as fast as she could go. She tried to keep in one direction and not circle around, but she was not at all sure that the direction she had chosen would lead her to the camp. By and by, to her great joy, she came upon a path. It ran to the right and to the left, being lost in the trees in both directions, and just before her, upon a big oak, there were fastened 2 signs, with arms pointing both ways. One said, "Take the other road to Bunbury." Bunbury. On the second sign it said, "Take the other road to Bunnybury." Well, exclaimed Bellina, eyeing the signs. "This looks as if we're getting back to civilization again." "Not sure about the civilization, dear," replied the little girl, "but it looks as if we might get somewhere, and that's a big relief anyhow." "Which path shall we take?" inquired the yellow hen. Dorothy stared at the signs thoughtfully. "Bunbury sounds like something to eat," she said. "Let's go there." "It's all the same to me," replied Bellina. She had picked up enough bugs and insects from the moss as she went along to satisfy her own hunger, but the hen knew Dorothy could not eat bugs, nor could Toto. The path to Bunbury seemed little traveled, but it was distinct enough and ran through the trees in a zigzag course until it finally led them to an open space filled with the queerest houses Dorothy had ever seen. They were all made of crackers laid out in tiny squares, and were of many pretty and ornamental shapes, having balconies and torches with posts of breadsticks and roof shingles with wafer crackers. There were walks of bread crusts leading from house to house and forming streets, and the place seemed to have many inhabitants. When Dorothy, followed by Bellina and Toto, entered the place, they found people walking the streets or assembled in groups talking together or sitting upon the porches and balconies. What funny people they were! Men, women, and children were all made of buns and bread. Some were thin and others fat, some were white, some light brown, and some very dark of complexion. A few of the buns, which seemed to form the more important classes of the people, were neatly frosted, kind of like powdered wigs. Some had raisins for eyes and currant buttons on their clothes. Others had eyes of cloves and legs of stick cinnamon, and many wore hats and bonnets frosted pink and green. There was something of a commotion in Bunbury when the strangers suddenly appeared among them. Women caught up their children and hurried into their houses, shutting the cracker doors carefully behind them. Some men ran so hastily that they tumbled over one another, while others, more brave, assembled in a group and faced the intruders defiantly. Dorothy at once realized that she must act with caution in order not to frighten these shy people, who were evidently unused to the presence of strangers. There was a delightful, fragrant odor of fresh bread in the town, and this made the little girl more hungry than ever. She told Toto and Bellina to stay back while she slowly advanced toward the group that stood silently waiting her. "You must excuse me for coming unexpected," she said softly, "but I didn't really know I was coming here until I arrived. I was lost in the woods, you know, and I'm as hungry as anything." "Hungry!" they murmured in a horrified chorus. "Yes, I haven't had anything to eat since last night's supper," she exclaimed. "Are there any edibles in Bunbury?" They looked at one another undecidedly, and then one portly bun man, who seemed a person of consequence, stepped forward and said, "Little girl, to be frank with you, we are all eatable. Everything in Bunbury is eatable to ravenous human creatures like you, but it is to escape being eaten and destroyed that we have secluded ourselves in this out-of-the-way place, and there is neither right nor justice in your coming here to feed upon us." Dorothy looked at him longingly. "You're bread, aren't you?" she asked. "Yes, bread and butter. The butter is inside me, so it won't melt and run. I do the running myself." At this joke, all the others burst into a chorus of laughter, and Dorothy thought they couldn't be much afraid if they could laugh like that. "Couldn't I eat something besides people?" she asked. "Couldn't I just eat one house or a sidewalk or something? I wouldn't mind much what it was, you know." This is not a public bakery, child," replied the man sternly. "It's private property. I know, my name is C. Bunn, Esquire," said the man. "C stands for cinnamon, and this place is called after my family, which is the most aristocratic in the town." "Oh, I don't know about that," objected another of the queer people. "The Grahams and the Browns and the Whites are all excellent family, and there is none better of their kind. I'm a Boston Brown myself." "I admit you are all desirable citizens," said Mr. Bunn rather stiffly, "but the fact remains that our town is called Bunbury." "Excuse me," interrupted Dorothy, "but I'm getting hungrier every minute. Now, if you're polite and kind, as I'm sure you ought to be, you'll let me eat something. There's so much to eat here that you'll never miss it." Then a big, puffed-up man of a delicate brown color stepped forward and said, "I think it would be a shame to send this child away hungry, especially if she agrees to eat whatever we can spare and not touch our people." "So do I, Pop," replied a roll who stood nearby. "Then what do you suggest, Mr. Over?" inquired Mr. Bunn. "Why, I'll let her eat my back fence if she wants to. It's made of waffles, and they're very crisp and nice. She may also eat my wheelbarrow," added a pleasant-looking muffin. "It's made of Nabiscos with a Zuzu wheel." Very good," remarked Mr. Bunn. "That is certainly very kind of you. Go with Pop Over and Mr. Muffin, little girl, and they will feed you." "Thank you very much," said Dorothy gratefully. "May I bring my dog Toto and the yellow hen? They're hungry too." "Will you make them behave?" asked the muffin. "Of course," promised Dorothy. "Then come along," said Pop Over. So Dorothy and Billina and Toto walked up the street, and the people seemed no longer to be at all afraid of them. Mr. Muffin's house came first, and as his wheelbarrow stood in the front yard, the little girl ate that first. It didn't seem very fresh, but she was so hungry that she was not particular. Toto ate some too, while Billina picked up the crumbs. While the strangers were engaged in eating, many of the people came and stood in the street, curiously watching them. Dorothy noticed 6 roguish-looking brown children standing all in a row, and she asked, "Who are you, little ones?" "We're the Graham Gems," replied one, "and we're all twins." "I wonder if your mother could spare one or two of you," asked Billina, who decided that they were fresh-baked. But at this dangerous question, the 6 little gems ran away as fast as they could. "You mustn't say such things, Billina," said Dorothy reprovingly. "Now let's go into Pop Over's backyard and get the waffles." "Oh, I sort of hate to let that fence go," remarked Mr. Over nervously as they walked towards his house. "The neighbors back of us are soda biscuits, and I don't care to mix with them." "But I'm hungry yet," declared the girl. "That wheelbarrow wasn't very big." "I've got a shortcake piano, but none of my family can really play on it," he said reflectively. "Suppose you eat that." "All right, I don't mind," said Dorothy. Anything to be accommodating. So Mr. Over led her into the house, where she ate the piano, which was of excellent flavor. "Is there anything to drink here?" she asked. "Yes, I've a milk pump and a water pump. Which will you have?" he asked. "I guess I'll try both," said Dorothy. So Mr. Over called to his wife, who brought into the yard a pail made of some kind of baked dough, and Dorothy pumped the pail full of cool, sweet milk and drank it eagerly. The wife of Pop Over was several shades darker than her husband. "Aren't you overdone?" the little girl asked her. "No, indeed," answered the woman. "I'm neither overdone nor done over. I'm just Mrs. Over, and I'm the president of the Bunbury Breakfast Band." Dorothy thanked them for their hospitality and went away. At the gate, Mr. Cinnamon Bun met her and said that he would show her around the town. "We have some very interesting inhabitants," he remarked, walking stiffly beside her on his cinnamon stick legs. "And all of us who are in good health are well bred. If you are no longer hungry, we will call upon a few of the most important citizens." Toto and Billina followed behind them, behaving very well, and a little way down the street they came to a handsome residence where Aunt Sally Lunn lived. The old lady was glad to meet the little girl and give her a slice of white bread and butter which had been used as a doormat. It was almost fresh and tasted better than anything Dorothy had eaten in town. "Where did you get the butter?" she inquired. We dig it out of the ground, which, as you may have observed, is all flour and meal," replied Mr. Bunn. "There is a butter mine just to the opposite side of the village. The trees which you see here are all doleanders and dodendras, and in the season we get quite a crop of doughnuts off them." "I should think the flour would blow around and get into your eyes," said Dorothy. "No," said he, "we are bothered with cracker dust sometimes, but never with flour." Then he took her to see Johnny Cake, a cheerful old gentleman who lived nearby. "I suppose you've heard of me," said old Johnny, with an air of pride. "I am a great favorite all over the world." "Aren't you rather yellow?" asked Dorothy, looking at him critically. "Maybe, child, but I don't think I'm bilious, for I was never in better health in my life," replied the old gentleman. "If anything ailed me, I'd willingly acknowledge the corn." "Johnny's a trifle stale," said Mr. Bunn as they went away, "but he's a good mixer and never gets cross-grained. I will now take you to call upon some of my own relatives." They visited the sugar buns, the currant buns, and the Spanish buns, the latter having a decidedly foreign appearance. Then they saw the French rolls, who were very polite to them, and made a brief call upon the Parker H. rolls, who seemed a bit proud and overbearing. "But they're not as stuck up as the frosted jumbles," declared Mr. Bunn, "who are people I really can't abide. I don't like to be suspicious or talk scandal, but sometimes I think the jumbles have too much baking powder in them." Just then a dreadful scream was heard, and Dorothy turned hastily around to find a scene of great excitement a little way down the street. The people were crowding around Toto and throwing at him everything they could find at hand. They pelted the little dog with hardtack, crackers, and even articles of furniture, which were hard-baked and heavy enough for missiles. Toto howled a little as the assortment of baked stuff struck him, but he stood still with head bowed and tail between his legs, while Dorothy ran up and inquired what was the matter. "Matter?" cried the rye loafer indignantly. "Why, the horrible beast has eaten 3 of our dear crumpets, and is now devouring a salt-rising biscuit." "Oh, Toto, how could you?" exclaimed Dorothy, much distressed. Toto's mouth was full of his salt-rising victim, so he only whined and wagged his tail, but Billina, who had flown to the top of a cracker house to be in a safe place, called out, "Don't blame him, Dorothy. The crumpets dared him to do it." "Yes, and you pecked out the eyes of the Raisin Bun, one of our best citizens," shouted a bread pudding, shaking its fist at the yellow hen. "What's that? What's that?" wailed Mr. Cinnamon Bun, who had just joined them. "Oh, what a misfortune! What a terrible misfortune!" "See here," said Dorothy, determined to defend her pets. "I think we've treated you all pretty well, seeing your eatables and regular food for us. I've been kind to you and eaten your old wheelbarrows and pianos and rubbish, and not said a word. But Toto and Billina can't be expected to go hungry when the town's full of good things they like to eat, because they can't understand your stingy ways as I do." "You must leave here at once," said Mr. Bunn sternly. "S'pose we won't go," said Dorothy, who was now much provoked. "Then," said he, "we will put you into the great ovens, where we are made, and bake you." Dorothy gazed around and saw threatening looks upon the faces of all. She had not noticed any ovens in the town, but they might be there nevertheless, for some of the inhabitants seemed very fresh. So she decided to go, and calling to Toto and Billina to follow her, she marched up the street, with as much dignity as possible, considering that she was followed by the hoots and cries of the buns and biscuits and other baked stuff. Chapter 18. How Ozma Looked into the Magic Picture. Princess Ozma was a very busy little ruler, for she looked carefully after the comfort and welfare of her people, and tried to make them happy. If any quarrels arose, she decided them justly. If anyone needed counsel or advice, she was ready and willing to listen to them. For a day or two after Dorothy and her companions had started on their trip, Ozma was occupied with the affairs of her kingdom. Then she began to think of some manner of the occupation for Uncle Henry and Aunt Em that would be light and easy, and yet give the old people something to do. She soon decided to make Uncle Henry the keeper of the jewels, for someone really was needed to count and look after the bins and barrels of emeralds, diamonds, rubies, and other precious stones that were in the royal storehouses. That would keep Uncle Henry busy enough, but it was harder to find something for Aunt Em to do. The palace was full of servants, so there was no detail of housework that Aunt Em could look after. While Ozma sat in her pretty room engaged in thought, she happened to glance at her magic picture. This was one of the most important treasures in all of the land of Oz. It was a large picture set in a beautiful gold frame, and it hung in a prominent place upon a wall of Ozma's private room. Usually this picture seemed merely a country scene, but whenever Ozma looked at it and wished to know what any of her friends or acquaintances were doing, the magic of this wonderful picture was straightway disclosed. For the country scene would gradually fade away, and in its place would appear the likeness of the person or persons Ozma might wish to see, surrounded by the actual scenes in which they were then placed. In this way the princess would view any part of the world she wished, and watch the actions of any one in whom she was interested. Ozma had often seen Dorothy in her Kansas home by this means, and now, having a little leisure, she expressed a desire to see her little friend again. It was while the travelers were at Fuddlecumjig that Ozma laughed merrily as she watched in the picture her friends trying to match the pieces of Grandmother Knit. "They seem happy and are doubtless having a good time," said the girl ruler to herself. And then she began to think of many adventures she herself had encountered with Dorothy. The image of her friends now faded from the magic picture, and the old landscape slowly reappeared. Ozma was thinking of the time when, with Dorothy and her army, she marched to the Gnome King's underground cavern beyond the land of Ev, and forced the old monarch to liberate his captives, who belonged to the royal family of Ev. That was the time when the Scarecrow nearly frightened the Gnome King into fits of throwing one of Billina's eggs at him, and Dorothy had captured King Rocat's magic belt and brought it away with her to the land of Ev. The pretty princess smiled at the recollection of this adventure, and then she wondered what had become of the Gnome King since. Merely because she was curious and had nothing better to do, Ozma glanced at the magic picture and wished to see in it the King of the Gnomes. Rokat the Red went every day into his tunnel to see how the work was getting along, and to hurry his workmen as much as possible. He was there now, and Ozma saw him plainly in the magic picture. She saw the underground tunnel reaching far underneath the deadly desert which separated the land of Oz from the mountains beneath which the Gnome King had his extensive caverns. She saw that the tunnel was being made in the direction of the Emerald City, and knew at once it was being dug so that the army of gnomes could march through it and attack her own beautiful and peaceful country. "I suppose King Rokat is planning revenge against us," she said musingly, "and thinks he can surprise us and make us his captives and slaves. How sad it is that any one can have such wicked thoughts! But I must not blame King Rokat too severely, for he is a gnome, and his nature is not so gentle as my own." Then she dismissed from her mind further thought of the tunnel for that time, and began to wonder if Aunt Em would not be happy as royal mender of the stockings of the ruler of Oz. Ozma wore few holes in her stockings. Still, they sometimes needed mending. Aunt Em ought to be able to do that very nicely. Next day the princess watched the tunnel again in her magic picture, and every day afterward she devoted a few minutes to inspecting the work. It was not especially interesting, but she felt that it was her duty. Slowly but surely the big arched hole crept through the rocks underneath the deadly desert, and day by day it drew nearer and nearer to the Emerald City. Chapter 19. How Bunnybury welcomed the strangers. Dorothy left Bunbury the same way she had entered it, and when they were in the forest again, she said to Billina, "I never thought that things good to eat could be so disagreeable." "Often I've eaten things that tasted good but were disagreeable afterwards," returned the yellow hen. "I think, Dorothy, if eatables are going to act badly, it's better before than after you eat them." "Perhaps you're right," said the little girl with a sigh. "But what shall we do now?" "Let us follow the path back to the signpost," suggested Billina. That will be better than getting lost again." "Why, we're lost anyhow," declared Dorothy. "But I guess you're right about going back to that signpost, Billina." They returned along the path to the place where they had first found it, and at once took the other road to Bunnybury. This road was a mere narrow strip, worn hard and smooth, but not wide enough for Dorothy's feet to tread. Still, it was a guide, and the walking through the forest was not at all difficult. Before long they reached a high wall of solid white marble, and the path came to an end at this wall. At first Dorothy thought there was no opening at all in the marble, but on looking closely she discovered a small square door about on a level with her head, and underneath this closed door was a bell push. Near the bell push a sign was painted in neat letters upon the marble, and the sign read, "No admittance except on business." This did not discourage Dorothy, however, and she rang the bell. Pretty soon a bolt was cautiously withdrawn, and the marble door swung slowly open. Then she saw it was not really a door but a window, for several brass bars were placed upon it, being set fast in the marble, and so close together that the little girl's fingers might barely go between them. Back of the bars appeared the face of a white rabbit, a very sober and sedate face, with an eyeglass held in his left eye and attached to a cord in his buttonhole. "Well, what is it?" asked the rabbit sharply. "I'm Dorothy," said the girl, "and I'm lost." "State your business, please," interrupted the rabbit. "My business," she replied, "is to find out where I am, and no one is allowed in Bunnybury without an order or a letter of introduction from either Ozma of Oz or Glinda the Good," announced the rabbit. "So that settles the matter," and he started to close the window. "Wait a minute," cried Dorothy. "I've got a letter from Ozma." "From the ruler of Oz?" asked the rabbit doubtingly. "Of course, Ozma's my best friend, you know, and I'm a princess myself," she announced earnestly. "Ha! Let me see your letter," returned the rabbit, as if he still doubted her. So she hunted in her pocket and found the letter Ozma had given her. Then she handed it through the bars to the rabbit, who took it in his paws and opened it. He read it aloud in a pompous voice, as if to let Dorothy and Billina see that he was educated and could read writing. The letter was as follows. "It will please me to have my subjects greet Princess Dorothy, the bearer of this royal missive, with the same courtesy and consideration they would expend to me." "Ha! It is signed Ozma of Oz," continued the rabbit, "and is sealed with the great seal of the Emerald City. Well, 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 how strange! How remarkable!" "What are you going on about?" inquired Dorothy impatiently. "We must obey the royal mandate," replied the rabbit. "We are subjects of Ozma of Oz, and we live in her country. Also, we are under the protection of the great sorceress Glinda the Good, who made us promise to respect Ozma's commands." "Then may I come in?" she asked. "I'll open the door," said the rabbit. He shut the window and disappeared, but a moment afterward a big door in the wall opened and admitted Dorothy to a small room which seemed to be a part of the wall and built into it. Here stood the rabbit who she had been talking with, and now that she could see all of him, she gazed at the creature in surprise. He was a good-sized white rabbit with pink eyes, much like all other white rabbits, but the astonishing thing about him was the manner in which he was dressed. He wore a white satin jacket and embroidered with gold and having diamond buttons. His vest was rose-colored satin with tourmaline buttons. His trousers were white to correspond with the jacket, and they were baggy at the knees, like those of a zouave. I don't really know. Zouave. Being tied with knots of rose ribbons. His shoes were of white plush with satin buckles, and his stockings were rose silk. The richness and even magnificence of the rabbit's clothing made Dorothy stare at the little creature wonderingly. Toto and Billina had followed her into the room, and when he saw them, the rabbit ran to a table and sprung upon it nimbly. Then he looked at the three through the monocle and said, "These companions, Princess, cannot enter Bunnybury with you." "Why not?" asked Dorothy. "In the first place, they would frighten our people, who dislike dogs above all things on earth, and secondly, the letter of the royal Ozma does not mention them." "But they're my friends," persisted Dorothy, "and go wherever I go." "Not this time," said the rabbit decidedly. "You yourself, Princess, are a welcome visitor, since you come so highly recommended, but unless you consent to leave the dog and the hen in this room, I cannot permit you to enter the town." "Never mind us, Dorothy," said Billina. "Go inside and see what the place is like. You can tell us about it afterwards, and Toto and I will rest comfortably here until you return." This seemed the best thing to do, for Dorothy was curious to see how the rabbit people lived, and she was aware of the fact that her friends might frighten the timid little creatures. She had not forgotten how Toto and Billina had misbehaved in Bunbury, and perhaps the rabbit was wise to insist on their staying outside the town. "Very well," she said. "I'll go in alone. I suppose you're the king of this town, aren't you?" "No," answered the rabbit. "I'm merely the keeper of the wicket, and a person of little importance, although I try to do my duty. I must now inform you, Princess, that before you enter our town you must consent to reduce." "Reduce what?" asked Dorothy. "Your size. You must become the size of the rabbits, although you may retain your own form." "Would my clothes be too big for me?" she inquired. "No, they will reduce when your body does." "Can you make me smaller?" asked the girl. "Easily," answered the rabbit. "And will you make me big again when I'm ready to go away?" "I will," said he. "All right, then, I'm willing," she announced. The rabbit jumped from the table and ran, or rather hopped, to the farther wall, where he opened a door so tiny that even Toto could scarcely have crawled through it. "Follow me," he said. Now, almost any other little girl would have declared that she could not get through so small a door, but Dorothy had already encountered so many fairy adventures that she believed nothing was impossible in the land of Oz. So she quietly walked toward the door, and at every step she grew smaller and smaller until by the time the opening was reached, she could pass through it with ease. Indeed, as she stood beside the rabbit, who sat upon his hind legs and used his paws as hands, her head was almost about as high as his own. Then the keeper of the wicket passed through, and she followed, after which the door swung shut and locked itself with a sharp click. Dorothy now found herself in a city so strange and beautiful that she gave a gasp of surprise. The high marble wall extended all around the place and shut out all the rest of the world, and here were marble houses of curious forms, most of them resembling overturned kettles, but with delicate, slender spires and minarets running far up into the sky. The streets were paved with white marble, and in front of each house was a lawn of rich green clover. Everything was as neat as wax, the green and white contrasting prettily together. But the rabbit people were, after all, the most amazing things Dorothy saw. The streets were full of them, and their costumes were so splendid that the rich dress of the keeper of the wicket was commonplace when compared with the others. Silks and satins of delicate hues seemed always used for material, and nearly every costume sparkled with exquisite gems. But the lady rabbits outshone the gentlemen rabbits in splendor, and the cut of their gowns was really wonderful. They wore bonnets, too, with feathers and jewels in them, and some wheeled baby carriages in which the girl could see wee bunnies. Some were lying asleep, while others lay sucking their paws and looking around them with big pink eyes. As Dorothy was no bigger in size than the grown-up rabbits, she had a chance to observe them closely before they noticed her presence. Then they did not seem at all alarmed, although the little girl naturally became the center of attraction, and all regarded her with great curiosity. "Make way!" cried the Keeper of the Wicket in a pompous voice. "Make way for Princess Dorothy, who comes from Ozma of Oz!" Hearing this announcement, the throng of rabbits gave place to them on the walks, and as Dorothy passed along they all bowed their heads respectfully. Walking thus through several handsome streets, they came to a square in the center of the city. In this square were some pretty trees and a statue in bronze of Glinda the Good, while beyond it were the portals of the royal palace, an extensive and imposing building of white marble, covered with a filigree of frosted gold. Chapter 20. How Dorothy Lunched with a King. A line of rabbit soldiers was drawn up before the palace entrance, and they wore green and gold uniforms with high shakos upon their head and held tiny spears in their hands. The captain had a sword and a white plume in his shako. "Salute!" called the Keeper of the Wicket. "Salute Princess Dorothy, who comes from Ozma of Oz!" "Salute!" yelled the captain, and all the soldiers promptly saluted. They now entered the great hall of the palace, where they met a gaily dressed attendant from whom the Keeper of the Wicket inquired if the king were at leisure. "I think so," was the reply. "I heard His Majesty blubbering and wailing as usual only a few minutes ago. If he doesn't stop acting like a crybaby, I'm going to resign my position here and go to work." "What's the matter with your king?" asked Dorothy, surprised to hear the rabbit attendant speak so disrespectfully of his monarch. "Oh, he doesn't want to be king, that's all, and he simply has to," was the reply. "Come," said the Keeper of the Wicket sternly, "lead us to His Majesty, and do not air out our troubles before strangers, I beg of you." "That is his royal, Why, if this girl is going to see the king, he'll air his own troubles," returned the attendant. "That is his royal privilege," declared the keeper. So the attendant led them into a room all draped with cloth of gold and furnished with satin-covered gold furniture. There was a throne in this room, set up on a dais, and having a big cushioned seat, and on this seat reclined the Rabbit King. He was lying on his back, with his paws in the air, and whining very like a puppy dog. "Your Majesty! Your Majesty, get up! Here is a visitor!" called out the attendant. The king rolled over and looked at Dorothy with one watery pink eye. Then he sat up and wiped his eyes carefully with a silk handkerchief, and put on his jeweled crown, which had fallen off. "Excuse my grief, fair stranger," he said in a sad voice. "You behold me in the most miserable monarch in all the world. What time is it, Blinkum?" 1 o'clock, your Majesty," replied the attendant to whom the question was addressed. "Serve luncheon at once," commanded the king. "Luncheon for 2. That's for my visitor and me, and see that the human has some sort of food she is accustomed to." "Yes, your Majesty," answered the attendant, and went away. "Tie my shoe, Bristle," said the king of the keeper to the Keeper of the Wicket. "Ah me, how unhappy I am!" "What seems to be worrying your Majesty?" said Dorothy. "Why, it's this king business, of course," he returned, while the keeper tied his shoe. "I didn't want to be king of Bunnybury at all, and the rabbits all knew it, so they elected me, to save themselves from such a dreadful fate, I suppose, and here I am shut up in a palace when I might be free and happy." "Seems to me," said Dorothy, "it's a great thing to be a king." "Were you ever king?" inquired the monarch. "No," she answered, laughing. "Then you know nothing about it," he said. I haven't inquired who you are, but it doesn't matter. While we're at luncheon, I'll tell you all my troubles. They're a great deal more interesting than anything you can say about yourself." "Perhaps they are to you," said Dorothy. "Luncheon is served!" cried Blinkum, throwing open the door, and in came a dozen rabbits in livery, all bearing trays which they placed upon the table, where they arranged the dishes in an orderly manner. "Now clear out, all of you!" exclaimed the king. "Bristle, you may wait outside in case I want you." When they had gone, and the king was alone with Dorothy, he came down from his throne, tossed his crown into a corner, and kicked some ermine robe under the table. "Sit down," he said, "and try to be happy. It's useless for me to try, because I'm always wretched and miserable. But I'm hungry, and I hope you are." "I am," said Dorothy. "I've only eaten a wheelbarrow and a piano today. Oh, yes, and a slice of bread and butter that used to be a doormat." "That sounds like a square meal," remarked the king, seating himself opposite her. "But perhaps it wasn't a square piano, eh?" Dorothy laughed. "You don't seem very unhappy now," she said. "But I am," protested the king, fresh tears glittering in his eyes. "Even my jokes are miserable. I'm wretched, woeful, afflicted, distressed and dismal as an individual can be. Are you not sorry for me?" "No," answered Dorothy honestly. "I can't say I am. Seems to me that for a rabbit you're right in clover. This is the prettiest little city I ever saw." "Oh, the city is good enough," he admitted. "Glinda the good sorceress made it for us because she was fond of rabbits. I don't mind the city so much, although I wouldn't live here if I had my choice. It is being king that has absolutely ruined my happiness." "Why wouldn't you live here by choice?" she asked. "Because it is all unnatural, my dear. Rabbits are out of place in such luxury. When I was young I lived in a burrow in the forest. I was surrounded by enemies and often had to run for my life. It was hard getting enough to eat at times, and when I found a bunch of clover I had to listen and look for danger while I ate it. Wolves prowled around the hole in which I lived, and sometimes I didn't dare stir out for days at a time. Oh, how happy and contented I was there! I was a real rabbit, as nature made me, wild and free, and I even enjoyed listening to the startled throbbing of my own heart." "I've often thought," said Dorothy, who was busily eating, "that it would be fun to be a rabbit." "It is fun, when you're the genuine article," agreed His Majesty. "But look at me now. I live in a marble palace instead of a hole in the ground. I have all I want to eat without the joy of hunting for it. Every day I must dress in fine clothes and wear that horrible crown till it makes my head ache. Rabbits come to me with all sorts of troubles when my own troubles are the only ones I care about. When I walk out, I can't hop and run. I must strut on my rear legs and wear an ermine robe. The soldiers salute me, and the band plays, and the other rabbits laugh and clap their paws and cry out, 'Hail to the king!' Now let me ask you, as a friend and a young lady of good judgment, isn't all this pomp and foolishness enough to make a decent rabbit miserable?" "Once," said Dorothy reflectively, "men were wild and unclothed and lived in caves and hunted for food as wild beasts do. But they got civilized in time, and now they'd hate to go back to the old days." "That is an entirely different case," replied the king. "None of you humans were civilized in one lifetime. It came to you by degrees. But I have known the forest and the free life, and that is why I resent being civilized all at once, against my will, and being made a king with a crown and an ermine robe. Pah!" "If you don't like it, why don't you resign?" she asked. "Impossible!" wailed the rabbit, wiping his eyes again with his handkerchief. "There's a beastly law in this town that forbids it. When one is elected a king, there is no getting out of it." "Who made the laws?" inquired Dorothy. "Same sorceress who made the town, Glinda the Good. She built the wall and fixed up the city and gave us several valuable enchantments and made the laws. Then she invited all the pink-eyed white rabbits of the forest to come here, after which she left us to our fate." "What made you accept the invitation and come here?" asked the child. "I didn't know how dreadful city life was, and I'd no idea I would be elected king," he said, sobbing bitterly. And now I'm it with a capital I, and I can't escape." "I know, Glinda," remarked Dorothy, eating for dessert a dish of Charlotte Russe. "And when I see her again, I'll ask her to put another king in your place." "Will you? Will you indeed?" asked the king joyfully. "I will if you want me to," she replied. "Oh, hooray!" shouted the king, and then he jumped up from the table and danced wildly about the room, waving his napkin like a flag and laughing with glee. After a time he managed to control his delight and returned to the table. "When are you likely to see Glinda?" he inquired. "Oh, perhaps in a few days," said Dorothy. "And you won't forget to ask her?" "Of course not." "Princess," said the Rabbit King earnestly, "you have relieved me of a great unhappiness, and I am very grateful. Therefore I propose to entertain you, since you are my guest, and I am the king, as a slight mark of my appreciation. Come with me to my reception hall." He then summoned Bristle and said to him, "Assemble all the nobility in the great reception hall, and also tell Blinkum that I want him immediately." The keeper of the wicket bowed and hurried away, and his Majesty turned to Dorothy and continued, "We'll have time for a walk in the gardens before the people get here." The gardens were back of the palace, and were filled with beautiful flowers and fragrant shrubs, with many shade and fruit trees, and marble-paved walks running in every direction. As they entered this place, Blinkum came running to the king, who gave him several orders in a low voice. Then his Majesty rejoined Dorothy and led her through the gardens, which she admired so very much. "What lovely clothes your Majesty wears," she said, glancing at the rich blue satin costume, embroidered with pearls, in which the king was dressed. "Yes," he returned with an air of pride, "this is one of my favorite suits, but I have a good many that are even more elaborate. We have excellent tailors in Bunnybury, and Glinda supplies all the material. By the way, you might ask the sorceress when you see her to permit me to keep my wardrobe." "But if you go back to the forest, you will not need clothes," she said. "No," he faltered, "that may be so. But I've dressed up so long that I'm used to it, and I don't imagine I'd care to run around naked again. So perhaps the good Glinda will let me keep the costumes." "I'll ask her," agreed Dorothy. Then they left the gardens and went into a fine big reception hall, where rich rugs were spread upon the tiled floors, and the furniture was exquisitely carved and studded with jewels. The king's chair was an especially pretty piece of furniture, being in the shape of a silver lily, with one leaf bent over to form the seat. The silver was everywhere, thickly encrusted with diamonds, and the seat was upholstered in white satin. "Oh, what a splendid chair!" declared Dorothy, clasping her hands admiringly. "Isn't it?" answered the king proudly. "It is my favorite seat, and I think it especially becoming to my complexion. While I think of it, I'd wish you'd ask Glinda to let me keep my lily chair when I go away." "It wouldn't look very well in a hole in the ground, would it?" she suggested. "Maybe not, but I'm used to sitting in it, and I'd like to take it with me," he answered. "But here come the ladies and gentlemen of the court, so please sit beside me and be presented." Chapter 21. How the King Changed His Mind. Just then a rabbit band of nearly 50 pieces marched in, playing upon golden instruments and dressed in neat uniforms. Following the band came the nobility of Bunbury, all richly dressed and hopping along on their rear legs. Both the ladies and the gentlemen wore white gloves upon their paws, with their rings on the outside of the gloves, as this seemed to be the fashion here. Some of the lady rabbits carried lorgnettes, which many of the gentlemen rabbits wore monocles, while many of the gentlemen rabbits wore monocles in their left eyes. The courtiers and their ladies paraded past the king, who introduced Princess Dorothy to each couple in a very grateful manner. Oh, graceful. Then the company seated themselves in chairs and on sofas and looked expectantly at their monarch. "It is our royal duty as well as our royal pleasure," he said, "to provide fitting entertainment for our distinguished guests. We will now present the Royal Band of Whiskered Friskers." As he spoke, the musicians, who had arranged themselves in a corner, struck up a dance melody, while into the room pranced the Whiskered Friskers. They were 8 pretty rabbits, dressed only in gauzy purple skirts fastened around their waists with diamond bands. Their whiskers were colored a rich purple, but otherwise they were pure white. After bowing before the king and Dorothy, the Friskers began their pranks, and these were so comical that Dorothy laughed with real enjoyment. They not only danced together, whirling and gyrating around the room, but they leaped over one another, stood upon their heads, and hopped and skipped here and there so nimbly that it was hard work to keep track of them. Finally, they all made double somersaults and turned handsprings out of the room. The nobility enthusiastically applauded, and Dorothy applauded with them. "They're fine," she said to the king. "Yes, the Whiskered Friskers are really very clever," he replied. "I shall hate to part with them when I go away, for they have often amused me when I was very miserable." "I wonder if you would ask Glinda—" "No, it wouldn't do at all," declared Dorothy positively. "There wouldn't be room in your hole in the ground for so many rabbits, especially when you get the lily chair and your clothes there. Don't think of such a thing, your Majesty." The king sighed. Then he stood up and announced to the company, "We will now hold a military drill by my picked bodyguard of royal pikemen." Now the band played a march, and a company of rabbit soldiers came in. They wore green and gold uniforms and marched very stiffly, but in perfect time. Their spears or pikes had slender shafts of polished silver with golden heads, and during the drill they handled their weapons with wonderful dexterity. "I should think you'd feel pretty safe with such a fine bodyguard." "I do," said the king. "They protect me from every harm. I suppose Glinda wouldn't—" "No," interrupted the girl. "I am sure she wouldn't. It's the king's own bodyguard, and when you are no longer king, you can't have 'em." The king did not reply, but he looked rather sorrowful for a time. When the soldiers had marched out, he said to the company, "The royal jugglers will now appear." Dorothy had seen many jugglers in her lifetime, but never any so interesting as these. There were 6 of them, dressed in black satin, embroidered with queer symbols in silver, a costume which contrasted strongly with their snow-white fur. First, they pushed in a big red ball, and 3 of the rabbit jugglers stood upon its top and made it roll. Then 2 of them caught up a third and tossed him into the air, all vanishing until only the 2 were left. Then one of these tossed the other upward and remained alone of all his fellows. This last juggler now touched the red ball, which fell apart, being hollow, and the 5 rabbits who had disappeared in the air scrambled out of the hollow ball. Next they all clung together and rolled swiftly upon the floor. When they came to a stop, only one fat rabbit juggler was seen, the others seeming to be inside him. This one leaped lightly into the air, and when he came down he exploded and separated into the original 6. Then 4 of them rolled themselves into round balls, and the other 2 tossed them around and played ball with them. These were but a few of the tricks the rabbit jugglers performed, and they were so skillful that all the nobility and even the king applauded as loudly as did Dorothy. "I suppose there are no rabbit jugglers in all the world to compare with these," remarked the king. And since I may not have the whiskered friskers or my bodyguard, you might ask Glinda to let me take away just 2 or 3 of these jugglers, will you?" "I'll ask her," replied Dorothy doubtfully. "Thank you," said the king. "Thank you very much. And now you shall listen to the winsome waggish warblers who have often cheered me in my moments of anguish." The winsome wagging warblers proved to be a quartet of rabbit singers, 2 gentlemen and 2 lady rabbits. The gentlemen warblers wore full-dress swallow-tailed suits of white satin with pearls for buttons, while the lady warblers were gowned in white satin dresses with long trails. The first song they sang began in this way: "When a rabbit gets a habit of living in a city and wearing clothes and furbelows and jewels rare and pretty, he scorns the bun who has to run and burrow in the ground, and pities those whose watchful foes are man and gun and hound." Dorothy looked at the king when she heard this song, and noticed that he seemed disturbed and ill at ease. "I don't like that song," he said to the warblers. "Give us something jolly and rollicking." So they sang to a joyous, tinkering melody as follows: "Bunnies gay delight to play in their fairy town secure. Every frisker flirts his whisker at a pretty-eyed girl demure. Every maid in silk arrayed at her partner's shyly glances. At her partner shyly glances. Paws are grasped, waists are clasped as they twirl in giddy dances. Then together through the heather, 'neath the moonlight soft they stroll. Each is very blithe and merry, gambolling with laughter droll. Life is fun to everyone, guarded by our magic charm. For to dangers we are strangers, safe from any thought of harm." "You see," said Dorothy to the king when the song ended, "the rabbits all seem to like Bunnybury except you, and I guess you're the only one that ever has cried or was unhappy and wanted to get back to your muddy hole in the ground." His Majesty seemed thoughtful, and while the servants passed around glasses of nectar and plates of frosted cakes, their king was silent and a bit nervous. When the refreshments had been enjoyed by all and the servants had retired, Dorothy said, "I must go now, for it's getting late and I'm lost. I've got to find the wizard and Aunt Em and Uncle Henry and all the rest sometime before night comes, if I possibly can." "Won't you stay with us?" asked the king. "You will be very welcome." "No, thank you," she replied. "I must get back to my friends, and I want to see Glinda just as soon as I can, you know." So the king dismissed his court and said he would himself walk with Dorothy to the gate. He did not weep or groan any more, but his long face was quite sullen, and his big ears hung dejectedly on each side of it. He still wore his crown and his ermine, and walked with a handsome gold-headed cane. When they arrived at the room in the wall, the little girl found Toto and Billina waiting for her very patiently. They had been liberally fed by some of the attendants, and were in no hurry to leave such comfortable quarters. The keeper of the wicket was by this time back in his old place, but he kept a safe distance from Toto. Dorothy bade good-bye to the king, as they stood just inside the wall. "You've been good to me," she said, "and I thank you ever so much. As soon as possible, I'll see Glinda and ask her to put another king in your place and send you back into the wild forest. And I'll ask her to let you keep some of your clothes in the lily chair and 1 or 2 jugglers to amuse you. I'm sure she will do it, 'cause she's so kind and she doesn't like anyone to be unhappy," said the king, looking rather downcast. I don't like to trouble you with my misery, so you needn't see Glinda." "Oh, yes, I will," she replied. "It won't be any trouble at all." But, my dear," continued the king in an embarrassed way, "I've been thinking the subject over carefully, and I find there are a lot of pleasant things here in Bunnybury that I would miss if I went away, so perhaps I'd better stay." Dorothy laughed. Then she looked grave. It won't do for you to be a king and a crybaby at the same time, she said. You've been making all the other rabbits unhappy and discontented with your howls about being so miserable. So I guess it's better to have another king. Oh, no, indeed, exclaimed the king earnestly. If you won't say anything to Glinda, I'll promise to be merry and gay all the time and never cry or wail again. Honor bright? She asked. On the royal word of the king, I promise it, he answered. All right, said Dorothy. You'd be a regular lunatic to want to leave Bunnybury for a wild life in the forest, and I'm sure any rabbit outside the city would be glad to take your place. Forget it, my dear, forget all this my foolishness, pleaded the king, earnestly. Hereafter I'll try to enjoy myself and do my duty to my subjects. So then she left him and entered through the little door into the room in the wall, where she grew gradually bigger and bigger until she had resumed her natural size. The keeper of the wicket led them into the forest and told Dorothy that she had been of great service to Bunnybury, because she had brought their dismal king to a realization of the pleasure of ruling so beautiful a city. I shall start a petition to have your statue erected beside Glinda's in the public square, said the keeper. I hope you will come again some day and see it. Perhaps I shall, she replied. Then, followed by Toto and Billina, she walked away from the high marble wall and started back along the narrow path toward the signpost. Chapter 22. How the Wizard Found Dorothy. When they came to the signpost, there, to their joy, were the tents of the wizard, pitched beside the path, and the kettle bubbling merrily over the fire. The Shaggy Man and Omby Amby were gathering firewood, while Uncle Henry and Aunt Em sat in their camp chairs, talking with the wizard. They all ran forward to greet Dorothy as she approached, and Aunt Em exclaimed, Goodness gracious, child, where have you been? You've played hooky the whole day, added the Shaggy Man reproachfully. Well, you see, I've been lost, explained the little girl, and I've tried awful hard to find the way back to you, but just couldn't do it. Did you wander in the forest all day? Asked Uncle Henry. You must be almost starving, said Aunt Em. No, said Dorothy, I'm not hungry. I had a wheelbarrow and a piano for breakfast and lunched with the king. Ah! Exclaimed the wizard, nodding with a bright smile. Oh, hey, Science. Hello, good to see you. I'll take a little break to chat. Oh, oh, I like your little emote. Well, welcome to Storytime, and I'm really quickly going to... Oh, and hello, I'm sorry, the, Necro, okay. And Europa. Hi, how are you guys doing? So these are my socials, the link's right here. How are you guys doing? How did you, find my stream, if you don't mind my asking? All of a sudden, so many people. Was there a raid or something that I missed? By the way, when I have this little guy right here, this is... Oh, yes, I love Honey. She's great. And... So this is Maestro right here. He is my little kitty boy. He is wonderful. And then the gray right here in my little webcam frame, which, sorry, I don't have a webcam again. Oh, thank you. That actually... yeah, I have a lot of... oh my gosh, that is so cute. Is that your own emote? That is adorable. I have a little gray tabby as well. It's Snockings. She is, well, she's 16. She's going to be turning, well, 16 and a half, thereabouts. But yeah, it's so good to see you all. I am Sunny, by the way. Oh, yeah. I agree. I believe every Discord channel should have a pet section So, you know, of course, that was like the very first channel that I had up on my Discord, was the pet pictures and all of that stuff. So if you join the Discord, please put up pet pictures. Ooh, nice. What kind of cat do you have? Oh yeah, sorry about I have moderator on high, like yeah, I have mod on high because, you know, I like it to be a family-friendly place. And so, you know, when my mod Corel is off. Oh, hey, Pupper. Good to see you. Hi, how are you doing? I know, yeah. Yeah, I had set that up before I had my... I haven't seen you in a while, Puppers. How you doing? So taking a little break. Oh my gosh. I love all of these emotes, are great. Yeah, probably. Yeah, busy life. Let's see. Oh, so cute. I love it. I have always, like, had cats in my life. I can't imagine life without a cat. Okay, enjoy your lurk, Science. Here's my little lurk emote. So enjoy. And yes, if you do join the Discord, please post up your pet pictures, because I love pet pictures. And also any art and, you know, stuff like that. And also, if you wanted to get caught up on any of the stories, I do have all of my stuff on YouTube. This is the playlists thing, so you won't have to worry about finding the next video in the series, anything like that. I just figure, you know, it's easier to do it that way. And I have 2 different story times. One of them is, that's about when I'm doing story time. One of them is like all ages, so this, you know, The Wizard of Oz and some of the other children's classics. And then I do have older ages story times. We just finished The Picture of Dorian Gray, and yesterday we started doing some Poe short stories. Although the short story that I did yesterday, I had to do some editing of the dialogue of a certain character because it was very inappropriate. So, yeah. Yeah, anyways, that is me. That is my kitties and my channel. And I hope that, yeah, very, very true, for sure. And I do have my little disclaimer here, which actually I have down below as well. Down below the video, you'll see a little bit more of my art. And, you know, the disclaimer was the first thing I think that I did because, yeah, they are all over 100 years old, so there is some little comments that they make that might be inappropriate. Sometimes you have, you know, a whole character who is just very not cool. In fact, I learned the hard way that the Brothers Grimm, really not PC. There was a whole entire story where the moral of the story was, I can't even mention it, was just so offensive. So I'm like, okay, I am not reading any more Brothers Grimm, and I took down the videos and everything. It was not a pleasant surprise. Yeah. Also, it's the trouble with, you know, reading something for the very first time online, on air live, because sometimes you don't see where it's going. So, yeah. Let's see. I think we're just one. Yeah. Yes, when you see this little guy right here, Maestro, the Meowing Maestro, That is where I am chatting with people, like between chapters and stuff like that. So I do this so that, when people are watching the VOD or watching on YouTube, and they don't want to listen to chat, they can just wait until this little guy goes away and then, just hop around and stuff like that. It's just something new that I'm trying. I originally had him for my Twitch Sings thing, and then they announced that they were going to be discontinuing Twitch Sings, which is a bummer. But, yeah. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get back to story time. You can go ahead and keep chatting. I will reply to chat at the end of the chapter. So, let's hide Maestro here. And, yeah, thank you. Alright. Chapter 22. How the Wizard Found Dorothy. When they came to the signpost, there, to their joy, were the tents of the wizard pitched beside the path, and the kettle bubbling merrily over the fire. The Shaggy Man and Omby-Amby were gathering firewood, while Uncle Henry and Aunt Em sat in their camp chairs talking with the wizard. They all ran forward to greet Dorothy as she approached, and Aunt Em exclaimed, "Goodness gracious, child! Where have you been?" "You've played hooky the whole day," added the Shaggy Man reproachfully. "You see, I've been lost," explained the little girl. "And I've tried awful hard to find the way back to you, but just couldn't do it." "Did you wander in the forest all day?" asked Uncle Henry. "You must be almost starved," said Aunt Em. "No," said Dorothy. "I'm not hungry. I had a wheelbarrow and a piano for breakfast, and lunched with a king." "Ah!" exclaimed the wizard, nodding with a bright smile. "So you've been having adventures again." "She's stark crazy," cried Aunt Em. "Who ever heard of eating a wheelbarrow?" "It wasn't very big," said Dorothy, "and it had a Zuzu wheel." "And I ate the crumbs," said Billina soberly. "Sit down and tell us about it," begged the wizard. "We've hunted for you all day, and at last I noticed your footsteps in this path and the tracks of Billina. We found the path by accident, and seeing it only led to 2 places, I decided you were at either one or the other of those places, so we made camp and waited for you to return. And now, Dorothy, tell us where you've been. To Bunbury or to Bunnybury?" "Why, I've been to both," she replied. "First I went to Utensia, which isn't on any path at all." She then sat down and related the day's adventures, and you may be sure Aunt Em and Uncle Henry were much astonished at the story. "But after seeing the cut-and-clips and the fuddles," remarked her uncle, "you ought not to wonder at anything in this strange country." "Seems like the only common and ordinary folk here are ourselves," rejoined Aunt Em diffidently. "Now that we're together again, one reunited party," observed the Shaggy Man, "what are we to do next?" "Have some supper and a night's rest," answered the wizard promptly, "and then proceed upon our journey." "Where to?" asked the Captain General. "We haven't visited the Rigmaroles or the Flutterbudgets yet," said Dorothy. "I'd like to see them, wouldn't you?" "They don't sound very interesting," objected Aunt Em. "But perhaps they are." "And then what?" continued the old wizard. "We will call upon the Tin Woodman and Jack Pumpkinhead and our old friend the Scarecrow on our way home." "That will be nice!" cried Dorothy eagerly. "Can't say they sound very interesting either," remarked Aunt Em. "Why, they're the best friends I have," asserted the little girl. "And you're sure to like 'em, Aunt Em, 'cause everybody likes 'em." By this time twilight was approaching, so they ate the fine supper which the wizard magically produced from the kettle, and then went to bed in the cozy tents. They were all up bright and early next morning, but Dorothy didn't venture to wander from the camp again for fear of more accidents. "Do you know where there's a road?" she asked the little man. "No, dear," replied the wizard, "but I'll find one." After breakfast he waved his hand toward the tents, and they became handkerchiefs again, which were at once returned to the pockets of their owner. Then they all climbed into the red wagon, and the Sawhorse inquired, "Which way?" "Never mind which way," replied the wizard. "Just go as you please, and you're sure to be right. I've enchanted the wheels of the wagon, and they will roll in the right direction, never fear." As the sawhorse started away through the trees, Dorothy said, "If we had one of these new-fashioned airships, we could float away over the top of the forest and look down and find just the places we want." "Airship? Pah!" retorted the old man scornfully. "I hate those things, Dorothy, although they are nothing new to either you or me. I was a balloonist for many years, and once my balloon carried me to the land of Oz, and once to the vegetable kingdom, and once Ozma had a gump that flew all over this kingdom, and hadn't sense enough to go where it was told to, which airships won't do. The house which the cyclone brought to Oz all the way from Kansas with you and Toto in it was a real airship at the time, so you'll see we've got plenty of experience flying with the birds." "Airships aren't so bad after all," declared Dorothy. "Some day they'll fly all over the world and perhaps bring people even to the land of Oz." "I must speak to Ozma about that," said the wizard with a slight frown. "It wouldn't do at all, you know, for the Emerald City to become a way station on an airship line." "No," said Dorothy, "I don't suppose it would. But what can we do to prevent it? I'm working out a magic recipe to fuddle men's brains, so they'll never make an airship that will go where they want it to go," said the wizard. "That won't keep the things from flying now and then, but it'll keep them from flying to the land of Oz." Just then the sawhorse drew the wagon out of the forest, and a beautiful landscape lay spread before the travelers' eyes. Moreover, right before them was a good road that wound away through the hills and valleys. "Now," said the wizard with evident delight, "we are on the right track again, and there is nothing more to worry about." "It's a foolish thing to take chances in a strange country," observed the Shaggy Man. "Had we kept to the roads, we never would have been lost. Roads always lead to some place, else they wouldn't be roads." "This road," added the wizard, "leads to Rigmarole Town. I'm sure of that because I enchanted the wagon wheels." Sure enough, after riding along the road for an hour or two, they entered a pretty valley where the village was nestled among the hills. The houses were munchkin-shaped, for they were all domes, with windows wider than were high, and pretty balconies over the front doors. Aunt Em was greatly relieved to find this town neither paperwork nor patchwork, and the only surprising thing about it was that it was so far distant from all other towns. As the sawhorse drew the wagon into the main street, the travelers noticed that the place was filled with people, standing in groups and seeming to be engaged in earnest conversation. So occupied with themselves were the inhabitants that they scarcely noticed the strangers at all, so the wizard stopped a boy and asked, "Is this Rigmarole Town?" "Sir," replied the king, "if you have traveled very much, you will have noticed that every town differs from every other town in one way or another, and so by observing the methods of the people and the way that they live, as well as the style of their dwelling places, it ought not to be a difficult thing to make up your mind about the trouble of asking questions whether the town bears the appearance of the one you intend to visit, or whether perhaps having taken a different road from the one you should have taken, you have made an error in your way and arrived at some point where—" "Land's sakes!" cried Aunt Em impatiently. "What's all this rigmarole around?" "That's it," said the wizard, laughing merrily. "It's a rigmarole because the boy is a rigmarole, and we've come to Rigmarole Town." "Do they all talk like that?" asked Dorothy wonderingly. "He might have said yes or no and settled the question," observed Uncle Henry. "Not here," said Omby Amby. "I don't believe the rigmaroles know what yes or no means." While the boy had been talking, several other people had approached the wagon and listened intently to his speech. Then they began talking to one another in long, deliberate speeches, where many words were used but little was said. But when the strangers criticized them so frankly, one of the women, who had no one else to talk to, began an address to them, saying, It is the easiest thing in the world for a person to say yes or no when a question that is asked for the purpose of gaining information or satisfying the curiosity of the one who has given expression to the inquiry has attached the attention of an individual who may be competent either of the personal experience or the experience of others to answer it with more or less correctness, or at least an attempt to satisfy the desire of information on the part of the one who has made the inquiry by— "Dear me!" exclaimed Dorothy, interrupting the speech. "I've lost all track of what you were saying." "Don't let her begin over again, for goodness' sake," cried Aunt Anne. But the woman did not begin again. She did not even stop talking, but went right on as she had begun, the words flowing out of her mouth in a stream. "I'm quite sure that if we waited long enough and listened carefully, some of these people might be able to tell us something in time," said the wizard. "Let's don't wait," returned Dorothy. "I've heard of the rigmaroles and wondered what they were like, but now I know and I'm ready to move on." "So am I," declared Uncle Henry. "We're wasting time here." "Why, we're all ready to go," said the Shaggy Man, putting his fingers to his ears to shut out the monotonous babble of those around the wagon. So the wizard spoke to the Sawhorse, who trotted nimbly through the village and soon gained the open country on the other side of it. Dorothy looked back as they rode away and noticed that the woman had not yet finished her speech, but was talking as glibly as ever, although no one was near to hear her. "If those people wrote books," Omby Amby remarked with a smile, "it would be a whole library to say the cow jumped over the moon." "Perhaps some of them do write books," asserted the little wizard. "I've read a few rigmaroles that might have come from this very town." "Some of the college lecturers and ministers are certainly related to these people," observed the Shaggy Man. "Oh, no, that was yesterday." "Yeah, sorry, Corral, I guess I should have posted a reminder. And no worries." Let's see. "Some of the college lecturers and ministers are certainly related to these people," observed the Shaggy Man. "And it seems to me that the Land of Oz is a little ahead of the United States in some of its laws. For here, if one can't talk clearly and straight to the point, they send him to Rigmarole Town, while Uncle Sam lets him roam around wild and free to torture innocent people." Dorothy was thoughtful. The rigmaroles had made a strong impression upon her. She decided that whether she spoke after all, she would use only enough words to express what she wanted to say. Yeah, sorry about that, Corral. I should have posted a reminder and been a little more clear. Yesterday was the one where I started at 4:30, and that went about, I think, about it was 1.5 hours. Today is just going to be a longer stream because this is turning out to be a much longer book than the other Oz books. But, yeah. No, it's like miscommunication. It's not just one or the other. But no worries. How have you been, by the way? I hope you had a good weekend. I hope you got some good sleep. I'm going to really quickly check on something. Oh, nice. Have you been making any more super fun buildings or homes or anything like that? Having fun being a vampire on there. I'm super stoked for you that you had that mod. Okay. Sorry, I was just looking very quickly at the end. I wanted to make sure that this didn't have a cliffhanger or anything. Oh, goodness. Oh, no. I've actually never played with, well, no, I've played with a mod on one game. It was a game called Dink Smallwood that was freeware back in the early aughts. And I played a bunch of those mods, but I haven't tried any mods in any of the other games that I've done. But I have seen, like, people playing heavily modded games, like Stardew Valley and stuff like that. I think it was actually Manny did a Stardew Valley that had like 150 mods on it. My word. And I know that my connection wouldn't be able to handle so many mods. Yeah. Well, I'm going to go ahead and continue the story, and go ahead, keep chatting. I'll reply after the chapter. Chapter 23. How they encountered the Flutterbudget. They were soon among the pretty hills and valleys again, and the Star Horse sped up hills and down at a fast and easy pace, the roads being hard and smooth. Mile after mile was speedily covered, and before the ride had grown at all tiresome, they sighted another village. The place seemed even larger than Rigmarole Town, but was not so attractive in appearance. "This must be the Flutterbudget Center," declared the Wizard. "You see, it's no trouble at all to find places if you keep to the right road." "What are the Flutterbudgets like?" inquired Dorothy. "I do not know, my dear, but Ozma has given them a town all their own. I've heard that whenever one of the people becomes a Flutterbudget, he is sent to this place to live." "That is true," Amby added. "Flutterbudget Center and Rigmarole Town are called the defensive settlements of Oz." The village they now approached was not built in a valley, but on top of a hill, and the road they followed wound around the hill like a corkscrew, ascending the hill easily until it came to the town. "Look out!" screamed a voice. "Look out, or you'll run over my child!" They gazed round and saw a woman standing upon the sidewalk, nervously wringing her hands as she gazed at them appealingly. "Where is your child?" asked the Sawhorse. "In the house," said the woman, bursting into tears. "But if it should happen to be in the road and you ran over it, those great deers would crush my little darling to jelly. Oh dear, oh dear. Think of my darling child being crushed into jelly by those giant wheels." "Get up," said the Wizard sharply, and the Sawhorse started on. They had not gone far before a man ran out of the house, shouting wildly, "Help! Help!" The Sawhorse stopped short, and the Wizard and Uncle Henry and the Shaggy Man and Amby jumped out of the wagon and ran to the poor man's assistance. Dorothy followed him as quickly as she could. "What's the matter?" asked the Wizard. "Help! Help!" cried the man. "My wife has cut her finger off, and she's bleeding to death." Then they turned and rushed back to the house, and all the party went with him. They found a woman in the front door, moaning and groaning as if in great pain. "Be brave, madam," said the Wizard consolingly. "You won't die just because you have cut off a finger. You may be sure." "But I haven't cut off a finger," she sobbed. "And what has happened?" asked Dorothy. I pricked my finger with a needle when I was sewing, and the blood came," she replied. "And now I have blood poisoning, and the doctors will cut off my finger, and that will give me a fever, and I shall die." said Dorothy. "I've pricked my finger many a time, and nothing happened." "Really?" asked the woman, brightening and wiping her eyes upon her apron. "Why, it's nothing at all," declared the girl. "You're more scared than hurt." "Oh, that's because she's a Flutterbudget," said the Wizard, nodding wisely. "I think I know what these people are like." "So do I," announced Dorothy. "Oh," sobbed the woman, giving way to a great burst of grief. "What's wrong now?" asked the Shaggy Man. "Oh, I suppose I pricked my toe," she wailed. "Then the doctors would have to cut my foot off, and I'll be lamed for life." "Surely, ma'am," replied the Wizard, "and if you'd pricked your nose, they might cut off your head, but you see you didn't. But I might have, she exclaimed and began to cry again. So they left her and drove away in their wagon, and her husband came out and began calling help as he had before, but no one seemed to pay any attention to him. As the travelers turned into another street, they found a man walking excitedly up and down the pavement. He appeared to be in a very nervous condition, and the wizard stopped him to ask, "Is anything wrong, sir?" "Everything is wrong," answered the man dismally. "I can't sleep." "Why not?" inquired Amby. "If I go to sleep, I'll have to shut my eyes," he exclaimed. "And if I shut my eyes, they may grow together, and then I'd be blind for life." "Did you ever hear of anyone's eyes growing together?" asked Dorothy. "No," said the man. "I never did, but it should be a dreadful thing, wouldn't it? And the thought of it makes me so nervous I'm afraid to go to sleep." "There's no help for this case," declared the wizard, and they went on. At the next street corner, a woman rushed up to them, crying, "Save my baby! Oh, good, kind people, save my baby!" "Is it in danger?" asked Dorothy, noticing that the child was clasped in her arms and seemed sleeping peacefully. "Yes, indeed," said the woman nervously. "If I should go into the house and throw my child out of the window, it would roll away down to the bottom of the hill, and then if there were a lot of tigers and bears down there, they would tear up my darling baby to pieces and eat it up." "Are there any tigers and bears in the neighborhood?" the wizard asked. "I never heard of any," admitted the woman. "But if there were, have you any idea of throwing your baby out of the window?" questioned the little man. "Not at all," she said. "But if all your troubles are due to those ifs," declared the wizard. "If you were not a Flutterbudget, you wouldn't worry." "There's another if," replied the woman. "Are you a Flutterbudget too?" "I will be if I stay here long," exclaimed the wizard nervously. "Another if!" cried the woman. But the wizard did not stop to argue with her. He made the sawhorse canter all the way down the hill, and only breathed easily when they were miles away from the village. After they had ridden in silence for a while, Dorothy turned to the little man and asked, "Do ifs really make Flutterbudgets?" "I think the ifs help," he answered seriously. "Foolish fears and worries over nothing, with a mixture of nerves and ifs, will soon make a Flutterbudget of anyone." Then there was another long silence, for all the travelers were thinking over this statement, and nearly all decided it must be true. The country they were now passing through was everywhere tinted purple, the prevailing color of the Gillikin country, but as the sawhorse ascended a hill, they found that upon the other side everything was a rich yellow hue. "Aha!" said the Captain General. "Here is the country of the Winkies. They are just crossing the boundary line." "Then we may be able to lunch with the Tin Woodman," announced the wizard joyfully. "Must we lunch on tin?" asked Aunt Em. "Oh, no," replied Dorothy. "Nick Chopper knows how to feed meat people, and he will give us plenty of good things to eat, never fear. I've been to his castle before." "Is Nick Chopper the Tin Woodman's name?" asked Uncle Henry. "Yes, it's one of his names," answered the little girl. "And another of his names is Emperor of the Winkies. He's the king of this country, you know, but Ozma rules over all the countries of Oz." "Does the Tin Woodman keep any Flutterbudgets or rigmaroles at his castle?" inquired Aunt Em uneasily. "No, indeed," said Dorothy positively. "He lives in a new tin castle, all full of lovely things." "I should think it would rust," said Uncle Henry. "He has thousands of Winkies to keep it polished for him," exclaimed the wizard. Oops, wrong voice. "His people love to do anything in their power for their beloved emperor, so there isn't a particle of rust in all the big castle." "I suppose they polish their emperor, too," said Aunt Em. "Why, some time ago he had himself nickel-plated," the wizard answered, "and he only needs rubbing up once in a while. He's the brightest man in all the world, is dear Nick Chopper, and the kindest-hearted. "I helped find him," said Dorothy reflectively. "Once the Scarecrow and I found the Tin Woodman in the woods, and he was just rusted still that time, and no mistake. But we oiled his joints and got him good and slippery, and after that he went with us to visit the wizard at the Emerald City." "Was that the time the wizard scared you?" asked Aunt Em. "He didn't treat us very well at first," acknowledged Dorothy, "for he made us go away and destroy the Wicked Witch, but after we found out he was only a humbug wizard, we were not afraid of him." The wizard sighed and looked a little ashamed. "When we try to deceive people, we always make mistakes," he said. "But I'm getting to be a real wizard now, and Glinda the Good's magic that I'm trying to practice can never harm anyone." "You were always a good man," declared Dorothy, "even when you were a bad wizard." "He's a good wizard now," asserted Aunt Em, looking at the little man admiringly. "The way he made those tents grow out of handkerchiefs was just wonderful. And didn't he enchant the wagon wheels so they'd find the road?" "All the people of Oz," said the Captain General, "are very proud of their wizard. He once made some soap bubbles that astonished the world." The wizard blushed at this praise, yet it pleased him. He no longer looked sad, but seemed to have recovered his usual good humor. The country through which they now rode was thickly dotted with farmhouses, and yellow grain waved in all the fields. Many of the Winkies could be seen working on their farms, and the wild and unsettled parts of Oz were by this time left far behind. These Winkies appeared to be happy, light-hearted folk, and all removed their caps and bowed low when the red wagon, with its load of travelers, passed by. It was not long before they saw something glittering in the sunshine far ahead. "See!" cried Dorothy. "That's the Tin Castle, Aunt Em!" And the Sawhorse, knowing his passengers were eager to arrive, broke into a swift trot that soon brought them to their destination. "30 mods is a lot." Chapter 24. How the Tin Woodman Told the Sad News. The Tin Woodman received Princess Dorothy's party with much grace and cordiality, yet the little girl decided that something must be worrying her old friend, because he was not so merry as usual. But at first she said nothing about this, for Uncle Henry and Aunt Em were fairly bubbling over with admiration for the beautiful tin castle and its polished tin owner. So her suspicion that something unpleasant had happened was for a time forgotten. "Where's the Scarecrow?" she asked, when they all had been ushered into the big tin drawing-room of the castle, the Sawhorse being led around to the tin stable in the rear. "Why, our old friend has just moved into his new mansion," explained the Tin Woodman. "It has been a long time in building, although my Winkies and many other people from all parts of the country have been busily working on it. At last, however, it is completed, and the Scarecrow took possession of his new house just 2 days ago." "I hadn't heard that he wanted a home of his own," said Dorothy. "Why doesn't he live with Ozma in the Emerald City? He used to, you know, and I thought he was happy there." "It seems," said the Tin Woodman, "that our dear Scarecrow cannot be contented with city life, however beautiful his surroundings might be. Originally he was a farmer, for he passed his early life in a cornfield, where he was supposed to frighten away the crows." "I know," said Dorothy, nodding. "I found him and lifted him down from his pole." "So now, after a long residence in the Emerald City, his tastes have turned to farm life again," continued the Tin Man. "He feels that he cannot be happy without a farm of his own, so Ozma gave him some land, and everyone helped him build his mansion, and now he has settled there for good." "Who designed his house?" asked the Shaggy Man. "I believe it was Jack Pumpkinhead, who is also a farmer," was the reply. They were now invited to enter the tin dining room, where luncheon was served. Aunt Em found, to her satisfaction, that Dorothy's promise was more than fulfilled, for although the Tin Woodman had no appetite of his own, he respected the appetites of his guests, and saw that they were bountifully fed. They passed the afternoon in wandering through the beautiful gardens and grounds of the palace. The walks were all paved with sheets of tin, brightly polished, and there were tin fountains and tin statues here and there among the trees. The flowers were mostly natural flowers and grew in the regular way, but their host showed them one flower bed, which was his especial pride. "You see, all common flowers fade and die in time," he exclaimed, "and so there are seasons when the pretty blooms are scarce. Therefore I decided to have created them with rare skills. Here you see 10 camellias, 10 marigolds, 10 carnations, 10 poppies, and 10 hollyhocks growing as naturally as if they were real." Indeed, they were a pretty sight, and glistened under the sunlight like spun silver. "Isn't this tin hollyhock going to seed?" asked the wizard, bending over the flowers. "Why, I believe it is!" exclaimed the Tin Woodman, as if surprised. "I hadn't noticed that before. But I shall plant the tin seeds and raise another bed of tin hollyhocks." In one corner of the gardens, Nick Chopper had established a fish pond in which they saw swimming and distorting themselves many pretty tin fishes. "Would they bite on hooks?" asked Aunt Em curiously. The Tin Woodman seemed hurt at this question. "Madam," said he, "do you suppose I would allow anyone to catch my beautiful fishes, even if they were foolish enough to bite on hooks? No, indeed. Every created thing is safe from harm in my domain, and I would as soon think of killing my little friend Dorothy as killing one of my tin fishes." "The Emperor is very kind-hearted, ma'am," exclaimed the wizard. "If a fly happened to light upon his tin body, he doesn't rudely brush it off, as some people might do. He asks it politely to find some other resting place." "What does the fly do then?" inquired Aunt Em. "Usually it begs his pardon and goes away," said the wizard gravely. "Flies like to be treated politely as well as others. And here in Oz they understand that what we say to them and behave very nicely." "Well," said Aunt Em, "flies in Kansas, where I come from, don't understand anything but a swat. You have to smash 'em to make 'em behave, and it's the same way with skeeters. Don't you have skeeters in Oz?" "We have some very large mosquitoes here, which sing as beautifully as songbirds," replied the Tin Woodman. "But they never bite or annoy our people because they are well fed and taken care of. The reason they bite people in your country is because they are hungry, poor things." "Well," agreed Aunt Em, "they're hungry all right, and they ain't very particular who they feed on. I'm glad you've got the skeeters educated in Oz." That evening after dinner they were entertained by the Emperor's tin cornet band, which played for them several sweet melodies. Also, the wizard did a few sleight-of-hand tricks to amuse the company, after which they all retired to their cozy tin bedrooms and slept soundly until morning. After breakfast, Dorothy said to the Tin Woodman, "If you'll tell us which way to go, we'll visit the Scarecrow on our way home." "I'll go with you and show you the way," replied the Emperor, "for I must journey today to the Emerald City." He looked so anxious as he said this that the little girl asked, "There isn't anything wrong with Ozma, is there?" "Not yet," said he, "but I'm afraid the time has come when I must tell you some very bad news, little friend." "Oh, what is it?" "Do you remember the Gnome King?" asked the Tin Woodman. "I remember him very well," she replied. "The Gnome King has not a kind heart," said the Emperor sadly, "and he has been harboring wicked thoughts of revenge because we once defeated him and liberated his slaves, and you took away his magic belt. So he has ordered his gnomes to dig a long tunnel underneath the deadly desert so that he may march his hosts right into the Emerald City. When he gets here, he intends to destroy our beautiful country." Dorothy was much surprised to hear this. "How did Ozma find out about the tunnel?" she asked. "She saw it in her magic picture." "Of course," said Dorothy. "I might have known that. And what is she going to do?" "I cannot tell," was the reply. "Pooh!" cried the Yellow Hen. "We're not afraid of the gnomes. If we roll a few of our eggs down the tunnel, they'll run way back as fast as they can." "Why, that's true enough," exclaimed Dorothy. "The Scarecrow once conquered all of the Gnome King's army with some of Billina's eggs." But you don't understand all of the dreadful plot," continued the Tin Woodman. "The Gnome King is clever, and he knows his gnomes would run from eggs, so he has bargained with many terrible creatures to help. These evil spirits are not afraid of eggs or anything else, and they are very powerful. So the Gnome King will send them through the tunnel first to conquer and destroy, and then the gnomes will follow after to get their share of the plunder and slaves." They were all startled to hear this, and every face wore a troubled look. "Is the tunnel all ready?" asked Dorothy. "Ozma sent me word yesterday that the tunnel was all completed except for a thin crust of earth at the end. When our enemies break through this crust, they will be in the gardens of the royal palace in the heart of the Emerald City. I offered to arm all my Winkies and march to Ozma's assistance, but she said no." "I wonder why?" asked Dorothy. "She answered that all the inhabitants of Oz gathered together were not powerful enough to fight and overcome the evil forces of the Gnome King. Therefore she refuses to fight at all." "But they will capture and enslave us, and plunder and ruin all of our lovely land." "Oh, sorry, that was the wizard." "But they will capture and enslave us, and plunder and ruin all of our lovely land," exclaimed the wizard, greatly disturbed by this statement. "I fear they will," said the Tin Woodman sorrowfully. "And I also fear that those who are not fairies, such as the wizard and Dorothy and her uncle and aunt, as well as Toto and Billina, will be speedily put to death by the conquerors." "What can be done?" asked Dorothy, shuddering a little at the prospect of this awful fate. "Nothing can be done," gloomily replied the Emperor of the Winkies. "But since Ozma refuses my army, I will go myself to the Emerald City. The least I can do is to perish beside my beloved ruler." Chapter 25. How the Scarecrow displayed his wisdom. This amazing news had saddened every heart, and all were now anxious to return to the Emerald City and share Ozma's fate. So they started without loss of time, and as the road led past the Scarecrow's new mansion, they determined to make a brief halt there and confer with him. "The Scarecrow is probably the wisest man in all of Oz," remarked the Tin Woodman when they started upon their journey. "His brains are plentiful and of excellent quality, and often he has told me things I might never have thought of myself. I must say I rely a great deal upon the Scarecrow's brains in this emergency." The Tin Woodman rode on the front seat of the wagon, where Dorothy sat between him and the wizard. "Has the Scarecrow heard of Ozma's trouble?" asked the general. "I do not know, sir," was the reply. "When I was a private," said Ambi, "I was an excellent army, as I fully proved in my war against the gnomes. But now there is not a single private left in our army, since Ozma made me the captain general, so there is no one to fight and defend our lovely ruler." "True," said the wizard. "The present army is composed only of officers, and the business of an officer is to order his men to fight. Since there are no men there there can be no fighting." "Poor Ozma," whispered Dorothy, with tears in her sweet eyes. "It's dreadful to think of all of her lovely fairy country being destroyed. I wonder if we couldn't manage to escape and get back to Kansas by means of the magic belt. And we might take Ozma with us and all work hard to get money for her, so she wouldn't be so very lonely and unhappy about the loss of her fairyland." "Do you think there would be any work for me in Kansas?" asked the Tin Woodman. "If you are hollow, they might use you as in a canning factory, suggested Uncle Henry. "But I can't see the use of your working for a living. You never eat or sleep or need a new suit of clothes." "I was not thinking of myself," replied the Emperor with dignity. "I merely wondered if I could not help to support Dorothy and Ozma." As they indulged in these sad plans for the future, they journeyed in sight of the Scarecrow's new mansion, and even though filled with care and worry over the impending fate of Oz, Dorothy couldn't help a feeling of wonder at the sight she saw. The Scarecrow's new house was shaped like an immense ear of corn. The rows of kernels were made of solid gold, and the grain upon which the ear stood upright was a mass of sparkling emeralds. Upon the very top of the structure was perched a figure representing the Scarecrow himself, and upon his extended arms, as well as upon his head, were several crows carved out of ebony and having ruby eyes. You may imagine how big this ear of corn was when I tell you that a single gold kernel formed a window, swinging outward upon hinges, while a row of 4 kernels opened to make the front entrance. Inside there were 5 stories, each story being a single room. The gardens around the mansion consisted of cornfields, and Dorothy acknowledged that the place was in all respects a very appropriate home for her good friend the Scarecrow. "He would have been very happy here, I'm sure," she said, "if only the Gnome King had left us alone. But if Oz is destroyed, of course this place would be destroyed too." "Yes," said the Tin Woodman, "and also my beautiful tin castle that has been my joy and pride." "Jack Pumpkinhead's house will go too," remarked the Wizard, "as well as Professor Wogglebug's Athletic College and Ozma's Royal Palace and all our other handsome buildings." "Yes, Oz will indeed become a desert when the Gnome King gets through with it," sighed Omby Amby. The Scarecrow came out to meet them and gave them all a hearty welcome. "I hear you have decided always to live in the Land of Oz after this," he said to Dorothy, "and that will delight my heart, for I have greatly disliked our frequent partings. But why are you all so downcast?" "Have you heard the news?" asked the Tin Woodman. "No news to make me sad," replied the Scarecrow. Then Nick Chopper told his friend of the Gnome King's tunnel, and how the evil creatures of the north had allied themselves with the underground monarch for the purpose of conquering and destroying Oz. "Well," said the Scarecrow, "it certainly looks bad for Ozma and all of us. But I believe it is wrong to worry over anything before it happens. It is surely time enough to be sad when our country is despoiled and our people made slaves. So let us not deprive ourselves of the few happy hours remaining to us." "Ah, this is real wisdom," declared the Shaggy Man approvingly. "After we become really unhappy, we shall regret these few hours that are left to us, unless we enjoy them to the utmost." "Nevertheless," said the Scarecrow, "I shall go with you to the Emerald City and offer Ozma my services." "She says we can do nothing to oppose our enemies," announced the Tin Woodman. "And doubtless she is right, sir," answered the Scarecrow. "Still, she will appreciate our sympathy, and it is the duty of Ozma's friends to stand by her side when the final disaster occurs." He then led them into his queer mansion and showed them the beautiful rooms in all the 5 stories. The lower room was a grand reception hall with a hand organ in one corner. This instrument the Scarecrow, then alone, could turn to amuse himself, as he was very fond of music. The walls were hung with white silk, upon which flocks of black birds were embroidered in black diamonds. Some of the chairs were made in the shape of big crows and upholstered with cushions of corn-colored silk. The second story contained a fine banquet room, where the Scarecrow might entertain his guests, and the 3 stories above that were bedchambers exquisitely furnished and decorated. "From these rooms," said the Scarecrow proudly, "one may obtain fine views of the surrounding cornfields. The corn I grow is always husky, and I call the ears my regiments, because they have so many kernels. I love the puns. Of course I cannot ride my cobs, but I really don't care shucks about that. Taken all together, my farm will stack up with any in the neighborhood." The visitors partook of some light refreshments, and then hurried away to resume the road to the Emerald City. The Scarecrow found a seat in the wagon between Omby Amby and the Shaggy Man, and his weight did not add much to the load, because he was stuffed with straw. "You will notice I have 1 oat field on my property," he remarked as he drove away. "Oat straw is, I have found, the best of all straws to restuff myself with when my interior gets musty or out of shape." "Are you able to restuff yourself without help?" asked Aunt Em. "I should think that after the straw was taken out of you, There wouldn't be anything left but your clothes." "You are almost correct, madam," he replied. "My servants do the stuffing under my direction. For my head, in which are my excellent brains, is a bag tied at the bottom. My face is neatly painted upon one side of the bag, as you may see. My head does not need restuffing as my body does, for all that it requires is to have the face touched up with fresh paint occasionally." It was not far from the Scarecrow's mansion to the farm of Jack Pumpkinhead, and when they arrived there, both Uncle Henry and Aunt Em were much impressed. The farm was one vast pumpkin field, and some of the pumpkins were of enormous size. In one of them, which had been neatly hollowed out, Jack himself lived, and he declared that it was a very comfortable residence. The reason he grew so many pumpkins was in order that he might change his head as often as it became wrinkled or threatened to spoil. The pumpkin-headed man welcomed his visitors joyfully, and offered them several delicious pumpkin pies to eat. "I don't indulge in pumpkin pies myself for 2 reasons," he said. "One reason is that when I eat pumpkins, I would become a cannibal, and the other reason is that I never eat, not being hollow inside." "Very good reasons," agreed the Scarecrow. They told Jack Pumpkinhead of the dreadful news about the Gnome King, and he decided to go with them to the Emerald City and help comfort Ozma. "I had expected to live here in ease and comfort for many centuries," said Jack dolefully. "But of course if the Gnome King destroys everything in Oz, I shall be destroyed too. Really, it seems too bad, doesn't it?" They were soon on their journey again, and so swiftly did the Sawhorse draw the wagon over those smooth roads that before twilight fell they had reached the royal palace in the Emerald City and were at their journey's end. Chapter 26. How Ozma Refused to Fight for Her Kingdom. Ozma was in her rose garden picking a bouquet with when the party arrived, and she greeted all of her old and new friends as smilingly and sweetly as ever. Dorothy's eyes were full of tears as she kissed the lovely ruler of Oz, and she whispered to her, "Oh, Ozma, Ozma, I'm so sorry." Ozma seemed surprised. "Sorry for what, Dorothy?" she asked. "For all your troubles about the Gnome King," was the reply. Ozma laughed with genuine amusement. "Why, that has not troubled me a bit, dear Princess," she replied. Then, looking around at the sad faces of her friends, she added, "Have you all been worrying about this tunnel?" "We have," they exclaimed in a chorus. "Well, perhaps it is more serious than I imagined," admitted the fair ruler. "But I haven't given the matter much thought. After dinner we will all meet together and talk it over." So they went to their rooms and prepared for dinner, and Dorothy dressed herself in her prettiest gown and put on her coronet, for she thought that this might be the last time she would ever appear as a Princess of Oz. The Scarecrow, the Tin Woodman, and Jack Pumpkinhead all sat at the dinner table, although none of them was made so he could eat. Usually they served to enlighten the meal with their merry talk, but tonight all seemed strangely silent and uneasy. As soon as the dinner was finished, Ozma led the company to her own private room, in which hung the magic picture. When they had seated themselves, the Scarecrow was the first to speak. "Is the Gnome King's tunnel finished, Ozma?" he asked. "It was completed today," she replied. "They have built it right under my palace grounds, and it ends in front of the forbidden fountain. Nothing but a crust of earth remains to separate our enemies from us, and when they march here, they will easily break through this crust and rush upon us." "Who will assist the Gnome King?" inquired the Scarecrow. "The Whimsies, the Growlywogs, and the Phanfasms," she replied. "I watched today in my magic picture the messenger whom the Gnome King sent to all these people to summon them to assemble in his great caverns." "Let us know what they're doing now," suggested the Tin Woodman. So Ozma wished to see the Gnome King's cavern, and at once the landscape faded from the magic picture and was replaced by the scene then being enacted in the jeweled cavern of King Roquat. A wild and startling scene it was which the Oz people beheld. Before the Gnome King stood the chief of the Whimsies and the grand Galliput of the Growlywogs, surrounded by their most skillful generals. Very fierce and powerful they looked, so that even the Gnome King and General Guff, who stood beside his master, seemed a bit fearful in the presence of their allies. Now a still more formidable creature entered the cavern. It was the first and foremost of the Phanfasms, and he proudly sat down in King Rocat's own throne and demanded the right to lead his forces through the tunnel in advance of all the others. The first and foremost now appeared to all eyes in his hairy skin and the bear's head, with his real form was even Rocat did not know. Although the arches leading into the vast series of caverns that lay beyond the throne room of King Rocat could be seen, ranks upon ranks of the invaders, thousands of Phanfasms, Growlywogs, and Whimsies, standing in serried lines, while behind them were massed the thousands upon thousands of General Guff's own army of gnomes. "Listen," whispered Ozma. "I think we can hear what they are saying." So they kept still and listened. "Is all ready?" replied the first and foremost haughtily. "The tunnel is finally completed," replied General Guff. "How long will it take us to march to the Emerald City?" asked the King Galliput of the Growlywogs. "If we start at midnight," replied the Gnome King, "we shall arrive at the Emerald City by daybreak. Then, while all the Oz people are sleeping, we will capture them and make them our slaves. After that we will destroy this city itself and march through the land of Oz, burning and devastating as we go." "Good!" cried the first and foremost. "When we get through with Oz, it will be a desert wilderness. Ozma shall be my slave." "She shall be my slave!" shouted the Grand Galliput angrily. "We'll decide that by and by," said King Rocat hastily. "Don't let us quarrel now, friends. Let us conquer Oz, and then we will divide the spoils of war in a satisfactory manner." The first and foremost smiled wickedly, but he only said, "I and my Phanfasms go first, for nothing on earth can oppose our power." They all agreed to that, knowing that Phanfasms to be the mightiest of the combined forces. King Rocat now invited them to attend a banquet he had prepared, where they might occupy themselves in eating and drinking until midnight arrived. As they had now seen and heard all of the plot against them that they cared to, Ozma allowed her magic picture to fade away. Then she turned to her friends and said, "Our enemies will be here sooner than I expected. What do you advise me to do?" "It is now too late to assemble our people," said the Tin Woodman despondently. "If you had allowed me to arm and drill my Winkies, we might have put up a good fight and destroyed many of our enemies before we were conquered." "The Munchkins are good fighters too," said Omby Amby, "and so are the Gillikins." "But I do not wish to fight," declared Ozma firmly. "No one has the right to destroy any living creature, however evil they may be, or to hurt them or make them unhappy. I will not fight, even to save my kingdom." "The Gnome King is not so particular," remarked the Scarecrow. "He intends to destroy us all and ruin our beautiful country." "Besides, because the Gnome King intends to do evil is no excuse for my doing the same," replied Ozma. "Self-preservation is the first law of nature," quoted the Shaggy Man. "True," she said True, she said readily. "I would like to discover a plan to save ourselves without fighting." That seemed a hopeless task to them, but realizing that Ozma was determined not to fight, they tried to think of some means that might promise escape. "Couldn't we bribe our enemies by giving them a lot of emeralds and golds?" asked Jack Pumpkinhead. "No, because they believe they are able to take everything we have," replied the ruler. "I've thought of something," said Dorothy. "What is it, dear?" "Let's use the magic belt to wish all of us to Kansas. We will put some emeralds in our pockets and can sell them in Topeka for enough to pay off the mortgage on Uncle Henry's farm. Then we can all live together and be happy." "What a clever idea!" exclaimed the Scarecrow. "Kansas is a very good country. I've been there," said the Shaggy Man. That seems to me an excellent plan, approved the Tin Woodman. No, said Ozma decidedly. Never will I desert my people and leave them to so cruel a fate. I will use the magic belt to send the rest of you to Kansas, if you wish. But if my beloved country must be destroyed and my people enslaved, I will remain and share their fate. Quite right, asserted the Scarecrow, sighing. I will remain with you. And so will I, declared the Tin Woodman and the Shaggy Man and Jack Pumpkinhead in turn. Tick-Tock, the Machine Man, also said he intended to stay by Ozma. For, he said, I should be of no use at all in Kansas. For my part, announced Dorothy gravely, if the ruler of Oz must not desert her people, the Princess of Oz has no right to run away either. I'm willing to become a slave with the rest of you, so all we can do with the magic belt is to use it to send Uncle Henry and Aunt Em back to Kansas. I've been a slave all my life, Aunt Em replied with considerable cheerfulness, and so is Henry. I guess we won't go back to Kansas anyway. I'd rather take my chances with the rest of you. Ozma smiled upon them gratefully. There is no need to despair just yet, she said. I'll get up early tomorrow morning and be at the Forbidden Fountain when the fierce warriors break through the crust of the earth. I will speak to them pleasantly, and perhaps they won't be so very bad after all. Why do they call it the Forbidden Fountain? Asked Dorothy thoughtfully. Don't you know, dear? Returned Ozma, surprised. No, said Dorothy. Of course I've seen the fountain in the palace grounds ever since I first came to Oz, and I've read the sign that says all persons are forbidden to drink at this fountain, but I never knew why they were forbidden. The water seems clear and sparkling, and it bubbles up in a golden basin all the time. That water, declared Ozma gravely, is the most dangerous thing in all the land of Oz. It is the water of oblivion. What does that mean? Asked Dorothy. Whoever drinks at the Forbidden Fountain at once forgets everything he has ever known, Ozma asserted. It wouldn't be a bad way to forget our troubles, suggested Uncle Henry. That is true, but you would forget everything else and become as ignorant as a baby, returned Ozma. Does it make one crazy? Asked Dorothy. No, it only makes one forget, replied the girl ruler. It is said that once, long, long ago, a wicked king ruled Oz and made himself and all his people very miserable and unhappy. So Glinda, the good sorceress, placed this fountain here, and the king drank of its waters and forgot all his wickedness. His mind became innocent and vacant, and when he learned the things of life again, they were all good things. But the people remembered how wicked their king had been, and were still afraid of him. Therefore he made them all drink of the water of oblivion and forget everything they had known, so that they became as simple and as innocent as their king. After that they all grew wise together, and their wisdom was good, so that peace and happiness reigned in the land. But for fear someone might drink of the water again and in an instant forget all he had learned, the king put that sign upon the fountain, where it has remained for many centuries up to this very day. They had all listened intently to Ozma's story, and when she finished speaking, there was a long period of silence while all thought about the curious magical powers of the water of oblivion. Finally, the Scarecrow's painted face took on a broad smile that stretched the cloth as far as it would go. How thankful I am that I have such an excellent assortment of brains. I gave you the best brains I ever mixed, declared the wizard with an air of pride. You did indeed, agreed the Scarecrow, and they worked so splendidly that they have found a way to save Oz, to save us all. I'm glad to hear that, said the wizard. We never needed saving more than we do just now. Do you mean to say that you can save us from those awful phantasms and growlywogs and whimsies? Asked Dorothy eagerly. I'm sure of it, my dear, asserted the Scarecrow, still smiling genially. Tell us how, cried the Tin Woodman. Not now, said the Scarecrow. You may all go to bed, and I advise you to forget your worries just as completely as if you had drunk of the water of oblivion in the Forbidden Fountain. I'm going to stay here and tell my plan to Ozma alone, but if you will all be at the Forbidden Fountain at daybreak, you'll see how easily we can save the kingdom when our enemies break through the crust of the earth and come from the tunnels. So they went away and let the Scarecrow and Ozma alone, but Dorothy could not sleep a wink at night. "He's only a scarecrow," she said to herself, "and I am not sure that his mixed brains are as clever as he thinks they are." But she knew that if the Scarecrow's plan failed, they were all lost, so she tried to have faith in him. Chapter 27. How the Fierce Warriors Invaded Oz. The Gnome King and his terrible allies sat at the banquet table until midnight. There was much quarreling between the Growlywogs and Phanfasms, and one of the wee-headed Whimsies got angry at General Guff and choked him until he nearly stopped breathing. Yet no one was seriously hurt, and the Gnome King felt much relieved when the clock struck 12 and they all sprang up and seized their weapons. "Aha!" shouted the first and foremost. "Now to conquer the land of Oz!" He marshaled his Phanfasms in battle array, and at his word of command they marched into the tunnel and began the long journey through it to the Emerald City. The first and foremost intended to take all the treasure of Oz for himself, to kill all who could be killed and enslave the rest, to destroy and lay waste the whole country, and afterwards to conquer and enslave the gnomes, the Growlywogs, and the Whimsies. And he knew his power was sufficient to enable him to do all these things easily. Next marched into the tunnel the army of gigantic Growlywogs, with their Grand Gallipoot at their head. They were dreadful beings indeed, and longed to get to Oz that they might begin to pilfer and destroy. The Grand Growlywog was a little afraid of the first and foremost, but he had a cunning plan to murder or destroy that powerful being and secure the wealth of Oz for himself. Mighty little of the plunder would the Gnome King get, thought the Grand Gallipoot. The chief of the Whimsies now marched his false-headed forces into the tunnel. In his wicked little head was a plot to destroy both the first and foremost, and the Grand Gallipoot. He intended to let them conquer Oz, since they insisted on going first, but he would afterward treacherously destroy them, as well as King Rokat, and keep all the slaves and treasure of Ozma's kingdom for himself. After all his dangerous allies had marched into the tunnel, the Gnome King and General Guff started to follow them, at the head of 50,000 gnomes, all fully armed. "Guff," said the king, "those creatures ahead of us those creatures ahead of us mean mischief. They intend to get everything for themselves and leave us nothing." "I know," replied the general, "but they're not as clever as they think they are. When you get the magic belt, you must at once wish the Whimsies and Growlywogs and Phanfasms all back into their own countries, and the belt will surely take them there." "Good," cried the king. "An excellent plan, Guff. I'll do it. While they are conquering Oz, I'll get the magic belt, and then only the gnomes will remain to ravage the country." So you see, there was only one thing that all were agreed upon, that Oz should be destroyed. On, the vast ranks of the invaders marched, filling the tunnels from side to side. With a steady tramp, they advanced, every step taking them nearer to the beautiful Emerald City. "Nothing can save the land of Oz," thought the first and foremost, scowling until his bare face was as black as the tunnel. "The Emerald City is as good as destroyed already," muttered the Grand Gallipoot, shaking his war club fiercely. "In a few hours Oz will be a desert," said the chief of the Whimsies with an evil laugh. "My dear Guff," remarked the Gnome King to his general, "at last my vengeance upon Ozma of Oz and her people is about to be accomplished." "You're right," declared the general. "Ozma is surely lost." And now the first and foremost, who was in advance, and nearing the Emerald City, began to cough and to sneeze. "Oh, this tunnel is terribly dusty," he growled angrily. "I'll punish that Gnome King for not having it swept clean. My throat and eyes are getting full of dust, and I'm as thirsty as a fish." The Grand Gallipoot was coughing too, and his throat was parched and dry. "What a dusty place!" he cried. "I'll be glad when we reach Oz, where we can get a drink." "Who has any water?" asked the Whimsy Chief, gasping and choking. But none of his followers carried a drop of water, so he hastened on to get through the dusty tunnel to the land of Oz. "Where did all this dust come from?" demanded General Guff, trying hard to swallow, but finding his throat so dry he couldn't. "I don't know," answered the Gnome King. "I've been in the tunnel every day while it was being built, but I never noticed any dust before." "Oh, let's hurry!" cried the general. "I'd give half a gold in Oz for a drink of water." Half the gold in Oz. The dust grew thicker and thicker, and the throats and eyes and noses of the invaders were filled with it. But not one halted or turned back. They hurried forward, more fierce and vengeful than ever. Chapter 28. How They Drank at the Forbidden Fountain. The Scarecrow had no need to sleep. Neither had the Tin Woodman or Tick-Tock or Jack Pumpkinhead, so they all wandered out into the palace grounds and stood beside the sparkling water of the Forbidden Fountain until daybreak. During this time they indulged in occasional conversations. "Nothing can make me forget what I know," remarked the Scarecrow, gazing into the fountain, "for I cannot drink of the water of oblivion, or water of any kind. And I am glad that this is so, for I consider my wisdom unexcelled." You are certainly very wise," agreed Tick-Tock. "For my part, I can only think by machinery, so I do not pretend to know as much as you do." "My tin brains are very bright, but that is all I claim for them," said Nick Chopper modestly. "Yet I do not aspire to being so very wise, for I have noticed that the happiest people are those who do not let their brains oppress them." "Mine never worry me," Jack Pumpkinhead acknowledged. "There are many seeds of thought in my head, but they do not sprout easily. I am glad that it is so, for if I occupied my days in thinking, I should have no time for anything else." In this cheery mood they passed the hours until the first golden streaks of dawn appeared in the sky. Then Ozma joined them, as fresh and lovely as ever, and robed in one of her prettiest gowns. Our enemies have not yet arrived," said the Scarecrow, after greeting affectionately the sweet and girlish ruler. "They will soon be here," she said, "for I have just glanced at my magic picture, and have seen them coughing and choking with the dust in the tunnel." "Oh, is there dust in the tunnel?" said the Tin Woodman. "Yes, Ozma placed it there by means of the magic belt," explained the Scarecrow with one of his broad smiles. Then Dorothy came to them, Uncle Henry and Aunt Em following close after her. The little girl's eyes were heavy because she had had a sleepless and anxious night. Toto walked by her side, but the little dog's spirits were very much subdued. Billina, who was always up by daybreak, was not long in joining the group by the fountain. The Wizard and the Shaggy Man next arrived, and soon after appeared Omby-Amby, dressed in his best uniform. "There lies the tunnel," said Ozma, pointing to a part of the ground just before the Forbidden Fountain, "and in a few minutes the dreadful invaders will break through the earth and swarm over the land. Let us all stand on either side of the fountain and watch to see what happens." At once they followed her suggestion and moved around the fountain of the water of oblivion. There they stood silent and expectant until the earth beyond gave way with a sudden crash, and up leaped the powerful form of the First and Foremost, followed by all of his grim warriors. As the leader sprang forward, his gleaming eyes caught the play of the fountain, and he rushed toward it and drank eagerly of the sparkling water. Many of the other phantasms drank too, in order to clear their dry and dusty throats. Then they stood around and looked at one another with simple, wondering smiles. The First and Foremost saw Ozma and her companions beyond the fountain, but instead of making an effort to capture her, he merely stared at her in pleased admiration of her beauty, for he had forgotten where he was and why he had come here. But now the Grand Gallipoot arrived, rushing from the tunnel with a hoarse cry of mingled rage and thirst. He, too, saw the fountain and hastened to drink of its forbidden waters. The other Growlywogs were not slow to follow suit, and even before they had finished drinking of the chief of the Whimsies and his people came to push them away, while they, one and all, cast off their false heads that they might slake their thirst, all at the fountain. When the Gnome King and General Guff arrived, they both made a dash to drink, but the general was so mad with thirst that he knocked his king over, and while Rocotte lay sprawling upon the ground, the general drank heartily of the water of oblivion. This rude act of his general made the Gnome King so angry that for a moment he forgot he was thirsty and rose to his feet to glare upon the group of terrible warriors he had brought here to assist him. He saw Ozma and her people, too, and yelled out, "Why don't you capture them? Why don't you conquer Oz, you idiots? Why do you stand there like a lot of dummies?" But the great warriors had become like little children. They had forgotten all their enmity against Ozma and against Oz. They had forgotten who they themselves were, or why they were in the strange and beautiful country. As for the Gnome King, they did not recognize him and wondered who he was. The sun came up and set its flood of silver rays to light the faces of the invaders. The frowns and scowls and evil looks were all gone. Even the most monstrous of the creatures there assembled smiled innocently and seemed light-hearted and content merely to be alive. Not so with Rocotte, the Gnome King. He had not drunk from the forbidden fountain, and all his former rage against Ozma and Dorothy now inflamed him as fiercely as ever. The sight of General Guff babbling like a happy child and playing with his hands in the cool waters of the fountain astonished and maddened King Rocotte. Seeing that his terrible allies and his own general refused to act, the Gnome King turned to order his great army of gnomes to advance from the tunnel and seize the helpless Oz people. But the Scarecrow suspected that what was in the king's mind and spoke a word to the Tin Woodman. Together they ran at Rocotte and grabbed him up, tossing him into the great basin of the fountain. The Gnome King's body was round as a ball, and it bobbed up and down in the water of oblivion, while he spluttered and screamed with fear lest he should drown. And when he cried out, his mouth filled with water which ran down his throat, so that straightway he forgot all he had formerly known, just as completely as had all the other invaders. Ozma and Dorothy could not refrain from laughing to see their dreaded enemies become as harmless as babies. There was no danger now that Oz could be destroyed. The only question remaining to solve was how to get rid of this horde of intruders. The Shaggy Man kindly pulled the Gnome King out of the fountain and sat him down upon his thin legs. Rocotte was dripping wet, but he chattered and laughed and wanted to drink more of the water. No thought of injuring any person was now in his mind. Before he left the tunnel, he had commanded his 50,000 gnomes to remain there until he ordered them to advance, as he wished to give his allies time to conquer Oz before he appeared with his own army. Ozma did not wish all these gnomes to overrun her land, so she advanced to King Rocotte, and taking his hand in her own, she said gently, "Who are you? What is your name?" "I don't know," he replied, smiling at her. "Who are you, my dear?" "My name is Ozma," she said, "and your name is Rocotte." "Oh, is it?" he replied, seeming pleased. "Yes, you are the king of the gnomes," she said. "Oh, I wonder what the gnomes are," returned the king, as if puzzled. "They are underground elves, and that tunnel over there is full of them," she answered. "You have a beautiful cavern at the other end of the tunnel, so you must go to your gnomes and say, 'March home,' then follow after them, and in time you will reach the pretty cavern where you live." The Gnome King was much pleased to learn this, for he had forgotten he had a cavern, so he went to the tunnel and said to his army, "March home!" At once the gnomes turned and marched back through the tunnel, and the king followed after them, laughing with delight to find his orders so readily obeyed. The wizard went to General Guff, who was trying to count his fingers, and told him to follow the Gnome King, who was his master. Guff meekly obeyed, and so all the gnomes quitted the land of Oz forever. But there were still the Phanfasms and Whimsies and Growlywogs standing around in groups, and they were so many that they filled the gardens and trampled upon the flowers and grass because they did not know that the tender plants could be injured by their clumsy feet. But in all other respects they were perfectly harmless, and played together like children, or gazed with pleasure upon the pretty sights of the royal gardens. After counseling with the Scarecrow, Ozma sent Omby Amby to the palace for the magic belt, and when the Captain General returned with it, the ruler of Oz at once clasped the precious belt around her waist. "I wish all these strange people, the Whimsies and the Growlywogs and the Phanfasms, safe back in their own homes," she said. It all happened in a twinkling, for of course the wish was no sooner spoken than it was granted. All the hosts of the invaders were gone, and only the trampled grass showed that they had ever been in the land of Oz. Chapter 29. How Glinda Worked a Magic Spell. "That was better than fighting," said Ozma, when all our friends were assembled in the palace after the exciting events of the morning, and each and every one agreed with her. "No one was hurt," said the wizard delightedly. "And no one hurt us," added Aunt Em. "But best of all," said Dorothy, "the wicked people have all forgotten their wickedness, and will not wish to hurt anyone after this. Well, except for all of the gnomes." "True, Princess," declared the Shaggy Man. "But it seems to me that to have reformed all these evil characters is more important than to have saved Oz." "Nevertheless," remarked the Scarecrow, "I'm glad Oz is saved. I can now go back to my new mansion and live happily. I'm glad and grateful that my pumpkin farm is saved," said Jack. "For my part," said the Tin Woodman, "I cannot express my joy that my lovely tin castle is not to be demolished by wicked enemies." "Still," said Tik-Tok, "other enemies may come to Oz some day." "Why do you allow your clockwork brains to interrupt our joy?" asked Omby Amby, frowning at the Machine Man. "I say that I am wound up to say what I am wound up to say," answered Tik-Tok. "And you are right," declared Ozma. "I myself have been thinking of this very idea, and it seems to me that there are entirely too many ways for people to get to the land of Oz. We used to think the deadly desert that surrounded us was enough protection, but that is no longer the case. The Wizard and Dorothy have both come here through the air, and I am told the Earth people have invented airships that can fly anywhere they wish them to go." "Why, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't," asserted Dorothy. "But in time the airships may cause us trouble," continued Ozma, "for if the Earth folk learn how to manage them, we would be overrun with visitors who would ruin our lovely secluded fairyland." "That's true enough," agreed the Wizard. "Also, the desert fails to protect us in other ways," Ozma went on thoughtfully. "Johnny Dewett once made a sand boat that sailed across it, and the Gnome King made a tunnel under it. So I believe something ought to be done to cut us off from the rest of the world entirely, so that no one in the future will ever be able to intrude upon us." "How will you do that?" asked the Scarecrow. "I do not know, but in some way I'm sure it can be accomplished. Tomorrow I will make a journey to the castle of Glinda the Good and ask her advice." "May I go with you?" asked Dorothy eagerly. "Of course, my dear Princess, and I also invite any of our friends here who would like to undertake the journey." They all declared they wished to accompany their girl ruler, for this was indeed an important mission, since the future of the Land of Oz is a great extent depended upon it. So Ozma gave orders to her servants to prepare for the journey on the morrow. That day she watched her magic picture, and when it showed her that all the gnomes had returned through the tunnel to their underground caverns, Ozma used the magic belt to close up the tunnel so that the earth underneath the desert sands became as solid as if it was before Ozma used the magic belt to close up the tunnel so that the earth underneath the desert sands became as solid as it was before the gnomes began to dig. Early the following morning, a gay cavalcade set out to visit the famous sorceress Glinda the Good. Ozma and Dorothy rode in a chariot drawn by the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger, while the Sawhorse drew the red wagon in which rode the rest of the party. With hearts light and free from care, they traveled merrily along the lovely and fascinating land of Oz, and in good season reached the stately castle in which resided the sorceress. Glinda knew that they were coming. "I have been reading about you in my magic book," she said as she greeted them in her gracious way. "What's your magic book like?" inquired Aunt Em curiously. "It is a record of everything that happens," replied the sorceress. "As soon as an event takes place, anywhere in the world, it is immediately found printed in my magic book, so when I read its pages, I am well informed." "Did it tell you how our enemies drank the water of oblivion?" asked Dorothy. "Yes, my dear, it told me all about it. And also it told me you were all coming to my castle, and why." "Then," said Ozma, "I hope you know what it is in my mind, and that I am seeking a way to prevent anyone in the future from discovering the land of Oz." "Yes, I know that. And while you were on your journey, I have thought of a way to accomplish your desire, for it seems to be unwise to allow too many outside people to come here. Dorothy, with her aunt and uncle, has now returned to Oz to live always, and there is no reason why we should leave any way open for others to travel uninvited to our fairyland. Let us make it impossible for anyone ever to communicate here with us in any way after this. Then we may live peacefully and contentedly." "Your advice is wise," returned Ozma. "I thank you, Glinda, for your promise to assist me." "But how can you do it?" asked Dorothy. "How can you keep everyone from ever finding Oz?" "By making our country invisible to all eyes but our own," replied the sorceress, smiling. "I have a magic charm powerful enough to accomplish that wonderful feat, and now that we have been warned of our danger by the Gnome King's invasion, I believe we must not hesitate to separate ourselves forever from all the rest of the world." "I agree with you," said the ruler of Oz. "Won't it make any difference to us?" asked Dorothy doubtfully. "No, my dear," Glinda answered assuringly. "We shall still be able to see each other and everything in the land of Oz. It won't affect us at all, but those who fly through the air over our country will look down and see nothing at all. Those who come to the edge of the desert or try to cross it will catch no glimpse of Oz or know in what direction it lies. No one will try to tunnel to us again because we cannot be seen and therefore cannot be found. In other words, the land of Oz will entirely disappear from the knowledge of the rest of the world." "Well, that's all right," said Dorothy cheerfully. "You may make Oz invisible as soon as you please, for all I care." "It is already invisible," Glinda stated. "I knew Ozma's wishes and performed the magic spell before you arrived." Ozma seized the hand of the sorceress and pressed it gratefully. "Thank you," she said. And now we're at the last chapter. Chapter 30. How the Story of Oz Came to an End. The writer of these Oz stories has received a little note from Princess Dorothy of Oz, which for a time has made him feel rather disconcerted. The note was written on a broad white feather from a stork's wing, and it said, "You will never hear anything more about Oz, because we are now cut off forever from the rest of the world. But Toto and I will always love you and all the other children who love us. Dorothy Gale." This seemed to me too bad at first, for Oz is a very interesting fairyland. Still, we have no right to feel grieved, for we have had enough of the history of the land of Oz to fill 6 storybooks, and from its quaint people and their strange adventures we have been able to learn many useful and amusing things. So good luck to little Dorothy and her companions. May they live long in their invisible country and be very happy. Alright, so we have come to the end of the Oz series. And I will go and summon the kitties have a little bit of kitty ASMR. Thank you for redeeming Give a Kitty a Treat, Corel. Maestro, snocking. Are they both sleeping? Amazing. I'll be right back. Maestro. Maestro. Are you being stubborn? No, you're just taking your time. Alrighty. I don't remember if I do know about that. Stockings behind you. Hey, Buffalo, come here. Stockings. Hey, over here. Maestro, over here. Oh, okay. This is from Corel. He says hi. And the kitties thank you, Corel. What was it? You just like swallowed them, Maestro. Did you get them all? I think you did. Yes, you did. Maybe I didn't know about that. I haven't been watching TV in quite a few years. Mostly I've just been watching stuff on the internet and, you know, the DVDs of shows that we have. But I'll have to look up the Emerald City. I do know that there were a couple of other things, like Tin Man was a miniseries that Sci-Fi did. It was strange. Hi. Thank you, Pants. I think tonight I'm going to be watching oh, wait a second, I want to move the alert box over everything so that when there is an alert, we can actually see it over the little image of Maestro. Yeah, anyways, so let's go ahead and raid somebody. Who are we going to raid? I see that Coffee with B is streaming, or was streaming about an hour ago. Yes, I would like to leave. Does anybody have any suggestions of who we should raid? Oh, nice. Yeah. So let's see. We have a lot of people on right now. Oh, there's Honey Crossing. Yeah, we're going to raid Honey Crossing because she was very awesome and directed some people our way. So we're going to go ahead and raid her. Oops, wrong one. All right, let's see. Get my little raid message ready. Yeah, that one. All right. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thank you so much for the follows, Europa, Necro, and Science. I'm glad you joined us. And next story time is going to be on Sunday. We're going to continue with some more Poe short stories. So I hope to see you next time, and have a good time zone, everybody. Bye.
sound just restarted. Hi, Sunny. Welcome in. Thank you for the raid. I hate that the alerts doesn't happen. You're under so much. Thank you for the raid. How was your stream? I was broken, but I hope you had a good stream and just like that. Chris, what should this hotel? Yeah, anyone who's not following Smoke and Sunny, please do it. A wonderful streamer here on Twitch. Very underrated. Just go follow. I did not see. Yeah, thank you. I hope you had a lovely stream. Say.
Yeah, and